Palestine was the British Empire's most dramatic failure. In the beginning, the British promised the Jewish people a home in an Arab country, a promise that led to hatred and bloodshed. Britain's undignified departure left the Palestinian people dispossessed and a Jewish state to fight for its life. Jerusalem, 1946. The King David Hotel, British government headquarters, dominates a country of 1 million Arabs and 500,000 Jews. The Jews are determined to kick the British out and achieve the Zionist goal, a state of their own. They blow up the building. For 2,000 years, Jews worldwide have prayed, "Next year in Jerusalem, we shall return to Zion." Now Zionist shock troops of the Irgun Zvi Leumi take matters into their own hands. 91 die, British, Arab and Jew.
I don't accept there was any brutality in anything we did. We were fighting a war. And a war involves, of course, force, and it's not good, it's not nice. We should have preferred not to have it. But brutality as such, for the sake of brutality, I don't believe anybody could accuse us of that.
We were hoping that Britain will help us save Palestine. Will help us save Palestine. All we wanted to Britain get out of Palestine and let us take it over and let democratic rule prevail there, which recognizes the rights of everybody living in Palestine.
My feeling was that we had tasked to try to guide a country and its people towards a prosperous and happy future. And here were one side of the equation who were using what we regarded, or what I regarded anyhow, as pretty unscrupulous means to pressurize us through world opinion. Now, I imagine that the Zionist cause in Palestine had a wider support in world opinion than any other colonial cause has ever had.
Zionism was born in Europe in the late 19th century, a Jewish dream of freedom from persecution in the biblical land of milk and honey. But to settle in a country inhabited by Arabs, the Jews needed protection. The British were to provide it. The British Army captured the Holy Land in the First World War, driving the Turks from the Middle East. Britain had a vision of a great new imperial domain stretching from India to Egypt. The victorious powers carved new states out of the desert, appointing their rulers. The British wanted Palestine as a military base to protect the vital artery of the empire, the Suez Canal. For this, they needed international approval. The Zionists tipped the balance.
The Zionists were the people who were lobbying all over the world in the Versailles Peace Conference and everywhere else to see that Britain did get this charge, so that there was a contract here. We would help Britain become the ruling power, and Britain would help us to develop the Jewish national home.
الإنجليز دخلت بلادنا سنة 17 وأنا كان عمري 7 سنين وحضرت تركيا وما كان في البلاد شيء إلا يهود وعرب مثل الإخوة وما في بيننا شيء اللي ينعد حرابة لكن الإنجليز استعماري كان يجيب بالألوف من الهجرة من اليهود ويحط في البلاد وحتى عمر وخلاهم يشتروا الأرض ويعملوا كل شيء ودخلت في الجيش 10 سنين وعارف السياسة تبعهم.
The Jewish settlers arrived from Europe to be looked after by their own administration, the Jewish Agency. They brought with them Western ways and money to buy up land. Thousands of Palestinian peasants were evicted, and in the towns many of the new jobs were for Jews only. In the 1930s, Palestinians took up arms against a colonial government that they believed was robbing them of the prospect of independence in their own country.
These pictures from Fateh's own cameraman in the east show the height of the danger in Jerusalem when arson, murder and wanton destruction were making the Holy Land a land of terror. But behind the outward peace lies still the threat of rebellion and disorder. Britain still stands by.
The British responded ruthlessly, but it took them 3 years to crush the uprising. Palestinian leaders were exiled, their movement disarmed. Hitler's defeat in the Second World War revealed the unbelievable. Auschwitz and the annihilation by the Nazis of some 25 million people. 6 million were Jews. The Holocaust was to break the back of Britain's Palestine policy. It won the Jews worldwide sympathy and the Zionists support in their demand for a Jewish state.
They can smile now, these people who a few short weeks ago thought they would never smile again. Then the entire camp is scorched off the face of the earth by British flamethrowers. The fires blot out the place, but not the memory.
Well, I was in Auschwitz when I realized that the only solution, or rather the only hope of survival for the Jews, for us Jews, would be a state of our own, a country where we could live and work, a country that could protect us. Of course, I didn't really believe that I would survive Auschwitz. But should I survive, I decided I would be a very dedicated Zionist.
From Britain and America, the Holocaust refugees got sympathy, but no offers of sanctuary. Undismayed, the Zionists called for them to be admitted to Palestine. They saw immigration as the key to a Jewish state, though they needed the new British Labour government to unlock the door. For Prime Minister Clement Attlee and his Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin, the request posed a dilemma. Jewish immigration to Palestine had been restricted before the war, and they were reluctant to lift the quotas.
Bevin's view was that one of the reasons we had fought the war was Nazi anti-Semitism. And one of the consequences of the war ought to be the possibility of Jews living normal lives in Europe again. He said this in public several times. Why now that Nazism has been destroyed, should the Jews not again contribute to the cultural and economic life of Europe as they did before? Bevin suggested after World War II that the Jews should not worry so much about Palestine. We should help to rebuild Europe on the smoking ruins of our families. That's what he suggested. That was the humanity which was shown to us by Mr. Bevin.
Of course, only Bevin saw very clearly that if you were to have Palestine flooded by Jews, whatever the humanitarian reasons, this was going to cause immense trouble, not only with the Arabs of Palestine, but also with the whole Islamic world and the Arab countries, with whom he also wanted to establish a new relationship which would not be the old relationship of protectorates and empire and all the rest of it.
The Arab rulers of the Middle East were now seen as pillars of the empire. British oil supplies, strategic routes, bases like Palestine, and defense against communism all depended on good relations with the Arab states. But the Arab League were vocal opponents of Jewish immigration to Palestine. They feared the Zionists' intentions, as did the Palestinians.
The problem is who have to suffer for the Jewish immigration. Why do they insist to come only to Palestine? Why? It's a political thing. It's far from humanitarian, to be humanitarian.
They had Britain to go to, they had the United States, they had all European countries. Why should we be victimized by the victims of the Nazis? Why should they come to our country?
Palestine was inhabited by Arabs, and we didn't want the Arabs to be displaced or deprived of their homeland or of their right to self-determination, like the people of Lebanon, of Jordan, of Iraq, of all the rest of the Arab world.
Though Palestinians still outnumbered Jews by 2 to 1, they had no say in the government and had no influence on British public opinion. Palestinian communities in towns and villages, along with their cause, were either ignored by the Western camera or portrayed in biblical cliches. The traditional way of life of the Arabs was contrasted with an image of industrious and progressive Jews who'd concentrated their efforts in the fertile coastal areas. They built up a Western-style economy, drawing on powerful international support. They also had an underground army, 50,000 strong, the Haganah. By 1946, the Zionists were using all these resources to defy Britain's immigration quotas.
I joined the Bricha. Bricha means escape, which was a division of the Haganah, of the Jewish underground movement. And in fact, my job was to smuggle people from the German border into Belgium or into France directly, or from Belgium into France. Most of the DP, the displaced person camps, were in the British zone, and they wanted to stop the Jews from going to Palestine, and they realized that the Haganah was in fact taking them to Palestine.
Newsreels followed as thousands of refugees were shipped to Palestine. Most of the boats were arrested by the British Navy and escorted into Haifa. British soldiers sent the so-called illegals to detention camps. Britain was charged with inhumanity.
A great many were persuaded that they should go to Palestine. And I think they're probably conned into it in many ways because the Zionists wished to use them as instruments in securing their objectives. We felt that if we had simply, out of a great surge of humanitarianism, said, oh, you poor people, you'd better come in, it was going to fracture our entire policy, and we had to, well, harden our hearts a bit and turn them back, a lot of them to Cyprus.
Onto that British vessel, Zionists are transferred from a small Jewish refugee ship to be deported to Cyprus, and some try to resist. So near to Zion, and now to be taken away. Removed from their tiny craft, they leave what has been an ordeal of evil conditions, unsanitary overcrowding and thirst. But to them, internment on Cyprus is just another exile, and they have to be forced.
Bevin wanted no more refugees in Palestine than the Arabs would agree to. But the Zionists demanded entry for 100,000 and had won the backing of the American president, Harry Truman. He controlled the aid that war-scarred Britain desperately needed.
I remember in Bevin's absence once, I had to receive the American ambassador. And he said he had a message from the president for the Secretary of State. The president wished to repeat his urgent and earnest request to admit immediately 100,000 Jewish refugees into Palestine. And I said that, according to my brief, I said that the Secretary of State's view was that this was simply a recipe for war. Well, the ambassador had expected this, and he simply said, very deliberately, the fact is that the president believes that if Mr. Bevin can accede to his request, that would help Britain's friends in Congress to get through the latest appropriation of British aid, which is how a diplomat says, I mean, there was bread rationing in Britain at that time, that's how a diplomat says, you do what we want or you'll go hungry.
And back here in Washington, domestic reflections of Palestine's days of crisis. President Truman meets with members of the Jewish war veterans, here to press demands for immediate admission of 100,000 refugees.
America had the largest Jewish community in the world, For Truman, their votes were vital. Influential Zionists had regular access to the White House, and some contributed generously to Truman's campaign funds.
President Truman's attitude toward Palestine was made up of mixed motives. He had been deeply horrified by the full scope of the Holocaust when we got into Eastern Europe and found out what that meant. He, of course, was heavily involved with Jewish people in the United States who were in support of Palestine from a political point of view.
Before every election, the influence of the Zionists reached a peak. In the summer of 1946, they urged Truman to call for partition, to create an independent Jewish state in a divided Palestine. White House aides persuaded Truman to support the Zionists' new demand.
As time went on, he concluded that the British were not going to solve the problem. He felt that there was substantial vacillation on the part of the British, and he came to the conclusion that if there was ever to be a Jewish homeland, which he desired greatly, it would have to be accomplished through partition.
Attlee and Bevin believed they were winning American support for a policy acceptable to the Arabs. The telegram from Truman telling them the opposite reached Attlee in Paris.
The telegram was brought to us, I think, in the middle of the night or early in the morning, anyhow, before breakfast. And we read it, and I took it to Attlee, who was having breakfast in bed. And he read the telegram through and said, handed it back to me. He said, "I'll send him a stinker. Go and draft it."
It made no difference to President Truman, though, whether they were upset or whether they weren't upset. He had a goal, and he was determined to achieve it.
In Palestine itself, the Zionists had turned to more direct methods. The campaign was led in secret by David Ben-Gurion and the leaders of the Jewish Agency, official advisors to the colonial government. Now they linked up with Menachem Begin, leader of the Irgun, and other extremists. This Irgun film helped raise money in America for secret shipments of arms.
We are no longer content with words alone. Only thus shall we win our freedom. We have heard the speeches and tried every means. Now we fight. I and my fellow fighters in the Hebrew resistance are answering British guns with Hebrew guns.
We did, of course, have an enormous amount of covered information about the organization of Jewish terrorism and the supply of arms, equipment, and so on to the Jewish terrorists. The Jewish Agency always denied that they were the policy makers in regard to acts of terrorism, but we knew a bit better than that.
The British wanted to prove the Jewish Agency's complicity in terrorism. In June 1946, troops arrested its leaders, rounded up some 3,000 people, and raided the kibbutzim, the suspected arsenals of the underground army, the Haganah.
Our infrastructure were the kibbutzim. The kibbutzim, like the kibbutz that we are just now, the kibbutzim was a place where we could pass for just civilians. We were working there for 15 days every month in order to make our living, and 15 days we were trained. And in every kibbutz we have a store, underground store for arms.
One of the unit, in fact, who were searching an outhouse and toilet, he had occasion, in fact, to use the toilet, and was quite surprised that once having pulled the chain and levered the seat in a particular direction, he started, in fact, to rise on his seat. And this revealed a tunnel beneath, which led to an arms cache which contained something in excess of 500 rifles and about 3,000 grenades. And he was a very surprised man.
Arms caches revealed an extensive network of military preparations. Ironically, it was the British who had first armed and trained Jewish settlers. Now, the guns were turned on their instructors, but the British were determined to keep their Palestine base.
This is Jerusalem, a name in every day's headline news. Pathé takes you into this city to show you where and how the British soldier is carrying out the dirtiest, most dangerous and most thankless job in the world today. For him, Jerusalem has no glamour, no mystery and no rewards. Only hard work and constant nerve-breaking suspense. Barbed wire, a people sullen and hostile. While Arab and Jew have a cause to battle for, the British soldier is there only because it is his job to keep the peace. That is the British Tommy's life in Palestine today. We salute him.
Our armed forces were very strong in the Middle East. There was the base in Egypt and also a lot of troops in Palestine, mainly used, of course, in dealing with Jewish and Arab malcontents, but still also a military base. And so there was no question of our just disappearing, as it were, rapidly. He was thinking in terms of a settlement, I think, which would have been acceptable to both Jews and Arabs, and which would have given us certain rights.
Meanwhile, the Zionists pressed ahead, building new kibbutzim in strategic areas, the military foundation of a Jewish state. Their partition scheme would give them less land than they wanted, but still a stronghold in which Jews could settle freely. Faced with the overwhelming energy of the Zionists, a Palestinian leader appealed to the British.
All we ask is to have the natural right of all nations, independence. We seek the setting up of a democratic government in which all genuine citizens will have the same rights and the same obligations.
Although the Arab League backed the Palestinian demand, Britain rejected it. But the Arabs still relied on Britain to withstand Zionist pressure.
Compared with the Zionists, they were separated by the totally different culture and procedures and politics of their countries and ours. I mean, if they did make some kind of submission in writing, it would be wrongly worded, the arguments would be wrong, it would be sent to the wrong person. Whereas, of course, the Zionist lobby was right in among British politics, and there were Zionists so close to the cabinet that there have been instances where cabinet ministers actually telephoned the result of a cabinet meeting straight to the Zionist concern.
Well, the fact is that the Arab states had never accurately estimated nor realized the power of Zionism. And they thought the Zionists were just a few Jews who were in Palestine and a few Jews who we know in Iraq and around. They didn't realize the power of Zionism in the United States, nor the influence of Zionism on the United States government.
At the end of 1946, Bevin went to America, knowing that many British cabinet ministers supported the Zionist plan for partition of Palestine. But in his talks with the Americans, he remained adamant that Britain would not risk antagonizing the Arabs. Bevin devised a new way out of the dilemma. Winning the cabinet over, he asked the United Nations to advise Britain on a solution.
We were ambivalent. On the one hand, we wanted to get out of Mr. Bevin's clutches. On the other hand, when he said, "I'll put it to the United Nations," he said this in a rather threatening voice. "You think I'm bad? All right, I'm going to suggest somebody who will hit you even harder, and you'll get nothing out of the UN at all."
Oh, we thought the United Nations were quite optimistic. We thought the United Nations would really act by the spirit of the Charter. And the spirit of the Charter certainly would have protected the rights of the Palestinians, the inhabitants of the country. But, of course, what happened was the cart was turned over by Truman.
From Palestine, first pictures of the latest bomb outrage. Jewish terrorists blow up the Goldsmith Officers Club in Jerusalem. 13 Britons were killed and 16 injured. Says Palestine Commander-in-Chief General Macmillan, the men responsible for these killings are not terrorists. They're just plain thugs and murderers.
Is he still alive, General Macmillan?
Yes, yes.
Well, I mean, you could call us anything. Of course he accused us of being, but I could say the same about him.
Of course, I have a tremendous sympathy, as all the British people did have, for the Jews for their persecution by Hitler. But that didn't detract from the fact that to get them settled in Palestine so that they did have a proper home had to be done in an orderly and constitutional manner, and not by murders.
The army decided to try on the Jews some of the methods familiar to the Palestinians from their rebellion. They stepped up death sentences on terrorists and imposed martial law on Jewish communities in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. It was a collective punishment: no work, no shops, no services, and strict curfews.
The martial law period was a much more active one from our point of view than any other period had been. We carried out 63 operations in the 16 days of martial law, because we had prepared, as I said, we planned it in a sense. We provoked it. And I remember the general in charge of the operation had a press conference every morning in the hotel, and he said, we've got them bottled up. You can see they're surrounded on three sides. On land and sea, you can see our boats patrolling the coast. And this went on for 16 days, and then martial law just collapsed.
Our hands were very considerably tied. Had the army been allowed, in fact, to act as an army, I feel we could have contained particular situations that just got out of hand to us being, frankly, too gentlemanly. We had to be seen to be acting in the right way.
4,000 miles away at the United Nations, the Zionists were winning support, contrary to British forecasts. In June 1947, a special committee, known as UNSCOP, was sent on a fact-finding tour. To the Arabs, this was yet another inquiry dominated by America, which had no right to pronounce on their future. Palestinian leaders boycotted its hearings. In contrast, the Jewish agency set out to impress.
We appointed two liaison officers, Horowitz, who was later our leading economist and banker, and myself, to accompany the commission and, as it were, illuminate the whole Zionist picture from their point of view. And therefore it was part of my job to see that they learnt as much about our point of view as possible.
The Zionist lesson was driven home by the legendary Exodus affair. It proved a powerful publicity coup.
With a cargo of 4,500 refugees, the Exodus is the largest ship ever to attempt to run the watchful British naval blockade. After a bloody battle with a British boarding party, the refugees disembark at Haifa. Some are dying. 20 others are in a serious condition. And as the tired and weary refugees are transferred to British prison ships, two members of the United Nations Committee on Palestine silently look on.
They actually went on board, some members of the UN Commission, and they saw the hose pipes and the tear gas being turned on these very wretched-looking people who had escaped from concentration camps in Germany. It was apparently such a squalid spectacle that the first thing that the UNSCOP decided was not partition or against partition, but the mandate has to end.
With the tide running against him, Bevin decided to make an example of the Exodus refugees. He sent them back where they had come from, to Germany and the refugee camps. For Bevin, it was a propaganda disaster. But Britain was in a tough mood. In Palestine, they hanged 3 more Irgun terrorists. Menachem Begin hit back. The Irgun kidnapped and hanged 2 British sergeants. They left their bodies booby-trapped for when the British found them.
All decent people must have been horrified by the murder by Jewish terrorists of the 2 British sergeants, Mervyn Pace and Clifford Martin. Until the appalling situation in Palestine is cleared up, unspeakable outrages may well continue.
With the burial of the sergeants went British hopes for a future in Palestine. Parliament and the public demanded the withdrawal of British troops.
I'm speaking on behalf of my mother, Mrs. Martin, who is broken-hearted and prostrate at the terrible news of the loss of her son. And let us hope that we can find a solution to this terrible problem in Palestine and bring an end to all this unnecessary murdering of young British innocent servicemen.
Obviously, it was becoming increasingly difficult for the armed forces to maintain law and order. Especially at that time, it was the Jews, who were obviously producing an extremely effective underground movement. And Bevin would have liked to deal with it, but it wasn't possible.
We were under very strong political pressure from the Foreign Office because they were looking at the wider national relations, for example, with the United States and also with the Arab world, and they were doing a careful balancing act, which often amounts to, well, anything you do will be difficult and dangerous, so let's do very little.
By the autumn of 1947, the cabinet had to make a decision. Economic crisis had forced Attlee once again to go cap in hand to America. The UN Special Committee had recommended that the British should go, leaving Palestine partitioned into a Jewish and an Arab state. Bevin said partition would mean war, and warned the UN that Britain would have no part in it. But at the General Assembly in November, the Zionists and the Americans used strong-arm tactics to win votes.
We were working very hard under the direct personal instruction of President Truman to get a successful vote on that. We used all the persuasion we could with delegates in New York. We went to many capitals bilaterally to try to get their governments to be sure that they had the instructions to work with us on this matter.
So in the meantime, pressure was brought on the states, on the capitals, and telephones from the Zionists and from Truman to the capitals, to heads of states, commands came to the members to change their vote. And some of them, like Romulo, had to run away because he was threatened by the Zionists. Haiti's representative began to cry when he was forced to change his vote. Belt of Cuba resigned as ambassador to Washington until he resigned rather than vote for partition. So Cuba appointed somebody else to vote for partition. The cleanliness of the case was destroyed. It was no more a clean business. You are British, you appreciate sportsmanship and being a clean game. It was no more a clean game. And I said that in the United Nations in 1947. I said the United Nations General Assembly has no jurisdiction and no right to partition a country against the wishes of the inhabitants.
The vote to partition Palestine would in the event mean war, for the Palestinians to defend their country, for the Jews to win a state.
The Jewish people at once began to celebrate the United Nations decision. If they hadn't got all they wanted, they had at least gained the verdict for the setting up of a new Jewish state, and their rejoicing was obviously a spontaneous affair. 2 days later, this was the typical scene. Arabs advancing on the center of Jerusalem at the beginning of a 3-day strike and an orgy of wrecking, looting, and bloodshed.
As Jews retaliated and the chaos spread, so began the most extraordinary 6 months of British colonial rule anywhere. Britain announced it would quit, in its own good time. Meanwhile, the British would do nothing but protect their own backs while the slow process of evacuation began. They would not maintain law and order, nor would they implement the United Nations plan to set up a Jewish and an Arab state. Nor would they let in the UN officials to do so themselves. For Bevin, this was the only honorable course.
We said, all right, the United Nations has a plan. We're not going to oppose it, but we don't think it'll work. It'll cause too much trouble with Arabs and Jews, and we are not going to take responsibility of executing it.
If we tried to impose partition, we would at once alienate the Arabs and probably start a war with them. The Arabs would then possibly gravitate to be friends with the Russians, and we would be involved in a futile war fighting Arabs who were our friends on behalf of Jews who you could hardly say were our friends at the time.
At the United Nations, the colonial secretary brushed aside the protests.
British public opinion will permit no more expenditure of life and treasure. It will acquiesce no longer in the use of British forces and the squandering of British lives to impose a policy in Palestine which one or other of the parties is determined to resist.
We had a feeling at that time that, I would say, to give them the benefit of the doubt, that they didn't care a damn what's going to happen, and if the Arabs will conquer the Arab Legion, all right, let them.
That doesn't interfere at all, the British administration. Never interferes in that. It's not their business. It's finished. You Jews and Arabs, deal with yourselves. Do what you want.
In the growing anarchy, the UN partition plan didn't stand a chance. The proposed Jewish state would contain hundreds of thousands of Arabs. The area allocated to the Palestinians was claimed by many Zionists as theirs by right. Both sides claimed Jerusalem as their sacred city and rejected the plan to make it international. In the vacuum created by the British, the issue was to be settled by the gun. Jewish forces were well prepared. They now trained openly for war. They'd set up a government for Jewish areas. The commanders saw no reason to keep within the UN boundaries. The Arabs, after all, had rejected them first.
They made their major mistake. If they would have accepted at that time the resolution, the Jewish state would have been perhaps as based on the United Nations resolution based on the partition. Once they broke the rules of the game, then there was no game.
We were fighting to live. We were fighting to stay in our houses. We know that the Zionist aims is to shift us all, to exert us all from all Palestine. We want to stay in our homes. Therefore, we fight for our children, for our land.
No one was well trained. The Jews were well trained because they knew what they were planning for. But we did not know what we were planning for because of our beloved leaders at that time.
The Palestinian leaders had been in exile and military activity suppressed. Now, villagers and groups of irregulars began training themselves, acquiring weapons where they could.
The best way to prevent the Zionists from attacking our villages is to try to cut their communications. Therefore, we attacked the convoys, and believe me, all the convoys we attacked were in armored cars, buses and trucks, and they were all armored cars from the steel the British troops provided for the Jews.
It was the convoys supplying the Jews in Jerusalem that the Palestinians hit the hardest. There were many casualties. The wrecks have since been made into monuments.
We blame the British for not keeping law and order that was their role until the final evacuation of Palestine, and especially keeping alive the road to Jerusalem, keeping free the road to Jerusalem. On the other side, they were really blessed not to intervene, and we were happy about that because it let us rather overcome the Arabs and do whatever we wanted in order to help Jerusalem to survive.
With the British keeping their distance, the Haganah defeated the Palestinian irregulars here at El Castel, dominating the Jerusalem road. It was part of a military offensive to secure the Jewish state. Gaining territory, preferably without its Arab inhabitants, was a welcome byproduct for the Jewish agency. For the Irgun, with whom they had an alliance, it was the main aim.
We had a plan that while we couldn't force the Jewish agency to go back on its agreement to the partition scheme, we as dissidents, and we didn't mind what they called us, thugs or terrorists or whatever, would go beyond these boundaries, win the battles as we hoped, and then hand over the territory as such to the Haganah to look after.
Jerusalem was one area in which there was a cooperation between the Irgun and the Haganah, and the commander of Jerusalem was giving latitude that according to the interest and according to his forces to cooperate with the Irgun.
On the night of April the 10th, 1948, Irgun soldiers surrounded the sleeping village of Deir Yassin near Jerusalem. What happened that night still fills Arabs with horror and a growing number of Jews with shame. Taken back to the scene after 35 years, the villagers remember.
اللي كانوا في سن ال20 وال25 وهذا شو كانوا يعملوا؟ كانوا يبقروا بطونهم الفران وابنه انحرقوا في الفرن داخل الفرن في باب الرئيس وهي عامله خبز عامله ابنها
قتلوها، قتلوا عمتي وقتلوا عم الحاج وقتلوا ابنها محمد.
اجى اليهودي مسك شد والله في اوريك كيف هذا شد اليهودي صار يشد في الهادي يسحب في الهذا لما ما سحبش مسك الهادي وذبح فؤاد ذبحوا على بطن على صدر امه.
يعني النكيز لو منعوا اليهود ما صارش في بلدنا هيك كان ما طخونا
ولو هالقد بعدين
ربونا مثل اليتامى. مين المسؤول عن بربي ولد؟ لما انت بتربي ولد وبيجي واحد بكتله انه المسؤول عنه.
The Haganah admitted that some 250 people had been massacred at Deir Yassin. The British did not intervene.
As far as I'm concerned, it did not come within the province of any of the conditions of which I laid down. But it was such a horrific thing that we felt that something ought to be done.
In the event, the British did nothing. The Haganah told Macmillan they were in charge of the village. For him, that was good enough.
So the priority then was to save British lives, but not Arab lives.
That's right. That's right.
As news of the massacre at Deir Yassin spread, the Palestinians began to flee in panic, some at gunpoint. Jewish forces stepped up their attacks on Arab villages and towns.
In many cases, they found themselves caught between, let's say, the devil and the deep blue sea, if you like. Since we blew up the installations or the houses within the villages, maybe they were terrorized by the terrorists, maybe they were not. I don't know. Then if they were afraid, and in some cases, and quite a number of them, they left the villages.
The Arabs were uprooted from their country by Jewish violence, or Zionist violence, you might like to call it. They didn't leave voluntarily. And if they had left voluntarily, they should have permitted them to go back. It was a plan to panic the Arabs and force them to leave the country. That's how they left.
In the end, more than 750,000 Palestinians were dispossessed, driven from their homes by force or fear. Most found shelter in makeshift camps, which later became their permanent homes. Hundreds of villages, even towns, were to be left deserted. Under the noses of the British, the Zionists expanded their territory across 3/4 of Palestine. In desperation, the Palestinians looked to their neighbors. The Arab states had promised to defend Palestine. But whether for the Palestinians or for themselves had never been clear.
We decided to set up a shadow government for the whole of Palestine. So when the British withdraw, it will take over the country. We couldn't do it by ourselves. We had to obtain Arab support. The Arab states did not see our point of view due to American and British influence.
The Arab armies were equipped by Britain. In an attempt to avert war, Bevin set up a deal with Abdullah, King of Jordan. When the British left Palestine, Abdullah's Arab Legion, under its British officers, could annex the Arab part, provided the Arab armies kept out of the Jewish part. The Zionist leaders were tipped off.
On one occasion, I was in the delegates' lounge of the United Nations, talking with Colonial Minister Creech Jones and Mr. Charette of the Zionist group. Just the three of us, and at one point, Mr. Creech Jones turned to Charette and said, "We know you're going to have your Arab state in Palestine, your Jewish state in Palestine. Of course, the Arab Legion would move, but it will move only into those areas assigned to the Arabs under the partition arrangement." Well, Charette, of course, took that as a statement of the greatest possible importance because the Arab Legion was the only effectively organized force in the Arab world, and it was under British command.
Despite the secret maneuvers of the British, their imminent departure now threatened to unleash war. Volunteers flocked to join the Arab armies as they gathered on the borders of Palestine. But their vast numbers gave a false impression.
We never had an army to fight with. Why did we get into this war? We had simply, the British didn't let us have an army. They let us have a few soldiers for receptions and for protocol and for drums and music, not for guns. So Britain is responsible for the weakness of the Arabs, but the Arabs themselves are to be blamed for lack of knowledge, lack of preparation, lack of unity. That's my view.
We were not going to help either side. I mean, we were, I think there became perhaps a bit later this agreement with the Americans that they would not arm the new state of Israel, in return for which we would stop our sending of arms to Arab countries.
On the 12th of May, 48, and I was still much younger than I am now, I was the head of the operations, I was summoned suddenly by Ben-Gurion to an emergency meeting of the temporary government of Israel. It was on a Wednesday, and about 10 of the 13 members were sitting there, and Ben-Gurion said to me, "We are about to decide to declare the state of Israel the moment the British will quit on the 15th. But members here would like to know from you, objectively as you can, without any expressing your own feelings whether a state should be declared or not, what are the chances of us defending this future state if the British will leave and the Arabs will invade the country?" I must say that this was the most difficult answer I ever had to give. And the gist of the answer was that I said that it is 50-50.
My feeling, and most of our feeling, was this: the Arabs were going to fight us whether we established a state or not. Therefore, why not establish it? Let them fight against us as a state and not fight against us as an anonymous community.
On May the 14th, 1948, the British High Commissioner took leave of Jerusalem for the last time. There was no United Nations authority to take his place. No one turned out to cheer or even boo as he left by the back streets for Haifa. The next day, David Ben-Gurion proclaimed the State of Israel. Its gates would be open to the 100,000 and more, as long as they were Jewish.
The British said that it was their duty, because of their common and dual duty to protect both the Jewish and Arabs, to behave the way they did. We didn't think so, but the Arabs didn't think so either.
Did they have a grudge against the British? They did, and they still have it. We believe sincerely that the cause of our plight and the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine is British.
we have been forced into this policy which we would not have chosen ourselves. But the policies we had wanted to follow had not been acceptable to other people, so we had washed our hands of it.
Palestine, the peaceful land the British took over, they turned into a battlefield. Their departure evoked worldwide contempt. The war that began as they left has not yet ended.
The hardback book, End of Empire, is available at all bookstores, including the ABC shop in your capital city. In a few moments, ABC News, then our simulcast of the Requiem by Verdi.
November 1953, a courtroom in Tehran. Dr. Mohammed Mossadegh, the man who put an end to British domination in Iran, is tried for treason. He is there because Britain and the United States have stage-managed a coup d'etat to overthrow his government.
Well, our policy was to get rid of Mossadegh as soon as possible. We didn't think he'd do any good to Iran. In the 2 years that he was there, it was too long for our thinking, he did nothing for Iran.
And don't forget that he opposed the British Empire before any other country in the Middle East had risen against the British Empire, and he was called the man who broke the back of the British Empire and threw the British out of the country.
Persia entered the 20th century in turmoil and decline. The former glories of its despotic rulers, the Shahs, had become an empty shell. Real power rested with two rival empires. To the north, the Russians, and to the south, the British in India, for whom Persia was a buffer state. Never formally part of the British Empire, Iran was more completely governed by British imperial priorities than were most colonies.
The Iranians had somehow got it into their heads, perhaps for historical reasons, that they were not really running their own affairs, that whatever happened in Iran was done by somebody else, and they always thought that it was either done or not done by the British. Erroneously, but one can see how they came to that way of thinking.
Il y avait beaucoup d'anecdotes qu'on faisait sur les Anglais. On disait que s'il y a la pluie, c'est parce que les Anglais l'ont voulu. S'il y a tel type comme Premier ministre, les Anglais l'ont nommé. Même dans les différentes villes de l'Iran, s'il passait quelque chose, même s'il y avait un crime, on croyait que c'est les intrigues des Anglais derrière ces crimes.
In the Second World War, British troops, now allied with the Soviets, occupied Iran to run it for their wartime needs. They deposed the Shah, a dictator who had turned towards Hitler, and put on the peacock throne his 21-year-old son, Mohammad Reza Shah. When the war ended and Allied troops withdrew, Iranians demanded democratic reforms and sovereign control of their own country. In the vanguard was veteran Democrat Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh.
Mossadegh, I don't think that there has been in the last 50 years anybody more prestigious than Mossadegh in the history of the country. Why? For one thing, Mossadegh was incorruptible. The second thing was he was against the power, always stood up to the power. And this started back in 1921 when he went against the coup d'etat government and he almost lost his life. He was imprisoned, he was banished, then he was for some years in his house. And as soon as the Shah left and there was a free election, he was the first member elected from Tehran.
Iranian resentment at foreign domination focused on the country's greatest asset, oil. In 1909, a British company had obtained the monopoly for the extraction of oil from the fields of southern Iran. The oil was pumped to a refinery at Abadan. Here, the new black gold was boiled, barreled, and shipped away in the company's tankers. For Britain, the oil find came at the right time. With World War I approaching, Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty, persuaded the government to buy a controlling share in Persian oil, so that the Navy, newly converted to oil, could have secure supplies. Oil soon became the driving force of the industrialized world, filling not only petrol tanks, but the coffers of the company and the British Treasury itself. Cheap oil from Iran helped put Britain on four wheels.
Okay, Jim, fill it right up, boy. It was certainly nice to be able to say that again, and tens of thousands of British motorists took full advantage of the opportunity. Roads out of London, as in the case of other centres, were mostly as crowded as in the good old days before petrol rationing began 10 years ago.
By 1950, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company was Britain's most profitable overseas investment. The dollar earnings of the refinery at Abadan were vital to keep the home economy afloat. For the British staff in charge in this sweltering climate, Abadan meant a truly colonial lifestyle.
I had just been married, so it was the first year of my marriage. And I was married to Eric, who was the general manager. So we had a very beautiful house, and we did an enormous amount of entertaining. In fact, the first year of our married life, I didn't think we ever sat down to a meal on our own except breakfast. And we always had that in our veranda. I think most people had servants. Again, I think there were points allotted to your husband, the size of your bungalow, and how many coolers you had, and how many servants you had.
The 70,000 Iranians employed by the company lived less well. Wages and welfare provisions were minimal. Conditions at Abadan were increasingly condemned. The company was accused of breaking its undertakings to the workforce.
L'immense majorité vivait dans ce que nous appelons en France des bidonvilles. Alors, les conditions d'existence de ces ouvriers étaient absolument incroyables. Et surtout, on savait que l'Angleterre, c'est-à-dire la compagnie, gagnait de l'argent énormément.
You had two groups. You had the Europeans who had everything and the Persians who had nothing. The Persians could not ride the same bus which the Europeans used it at the time, or enter any clubs or any housing or any facilities. And this made them more angry than anything else.
There was a wider feeling, perhaps, that the oil company interfered in internal Iranian political affairs, and that it had a wide network of political connections within the country itself.
Iranians complained that Britain took 9 times more revenue from the oil than Iran did. The mass of Iranians lived in grinding poverty. In the towns, there was a movement for change. The Iranian parliament, the Majlis, became the platform for a campaign to nationalize the oil company. For its leader, Mossadegh, this was the way to regain Iran's independence, a battle he had fought for 30 years. Now his moment had come. In April 1951, he became prime minister, but the British failed to take him seriously.
He appeared as a demagogue, not necessarily, it appeared to us at the time, in charge himself, but possibly being used by others. His way of living and general appearance didn't strike one as being the sort of person you would think of as a prime minister, and I don't mean them because he didn't wear striped trousers. In fact, he always wore pajamas, and that was a rather odd figure for a future prime minister to cut.
At no time before a year or two before 1951 did anyone contemplate that we would ever not stay there forever. We were there by an international agreement between the government of Iran and the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. So there was no reason it should ever come to an end as far as we could see.
Tehran. Angry crowds surge through the capital of Iran, currently the world's #1 danger zone. John Bull and Uncle Sam, too, are savagely caricatured. Extreme nationalists demand immediate seizure by their government of the $500 million Anglo-Iranian oil company. Focal point of Iranian unrest, however, is the government. Its cabinet headed by 70-year-old Premier Mohammad Mossadegh, whose single purpose is oil nationalization.
He was a great actor, but he was a marvelous politician, and at that time he had all the people with him. Everywhere you went, they would say, Zindabad, Dr. Mossadegh, Zindabad, Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh, Nakhost Wazir Mahbub Iran, which means long live Dr. Mossadegh, the beloved Prime Minister of Iran. And they didn't care much what he did. He'd clobbered the imperialists, he'd nationalized the oil company. Iran was a country again. It was great stuff. It was very moving.
We would call him Dotty in some respects. But he wasn't impersonized, and some of the very moderate Persian parliamentarians would weep in the Majlis when he spoke, even though they knew perfectly well that it was ruinous for their country and impractical.
Le thème de propagande de Mossadegh, ses partisans, c'était changeons le visage du monde, au moins du monde musulman, en changeant nos rapports avec les Anglais. En mettant fin à la domination anglaise, nous arrivons à changer le visage, non seulement de notre pays, mais de l'ensemble.
The atmosphere was one of complete joy, particularly as if it looked as if there was really no conflict, no opposition within the country, as if the whole country had rallied and found a leader who was going to lead the country towards better times. That was the atmosphere. The press, the newspapers, the radio, the parliament, they all appeared to be united in these events.
As the nationalization law went through, demonstrators tore down the company's nameplates. The British protested and even sabotaged machinery as Mossadegh sent his men to Abadan to take over the refinery.
The reception was extraordinary because there was a feeling that now all the defects of the old regime, which were, in a word, discrimination against Iranians, all those defects would be removed because all the administration of the industry would be in the hands of Iranians. So they had a wonderful reception on arrival.
There was no question of violent resistance, but extraordinary how pieces of plant would go wrong just when they were supposed to be doing something else, you know. And they soon realized that we weren't being very helpful, really, and we weren't handing over files. We weren't handing over accounts, which they asked us for. I said I had no authority to hand them British companies' accounts unless I was told from London.
Back in London, the Labour Foreign Secretary, Herbert Morrison, was devoting his time to the Festival of Britain, designed to boost national morale. But Labour's plans for welfare at home depended on profits from abroad. Morrison was determined to resist Iran's blow beneath the imperial belt. With the press right behind him, he denounced the Iranian act as illegal. To add weight to his words, the government sent the destroyer Mauritius to Abadan.
London, where directors of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company met to discuss the latest news from the Persian oil fields. The man bringing home the news was Mr. Drake, the company's general manager in Abadan. Later, Mr. Drake, at Mr. Attlee's invitation, went to number 10 to place before the cabinet a first-hand account of the present Persian drama.
And I was wheeled into this cabinet meeting, where I understand the entire cabinet, except the minister responsible for oil, I don't know who he was now, and the three chiefs of staff in uniform were all seated round a table. The Prime Minister bid me take a seat on his right, between him and Mr. Morrison, the Foreign Secretary. And I pleaded that we should not allow the biggest foreign asset in Britain to go without doing something about it. I didn't say particularly what was to be done. I had in my own mind that at least we should make a struggle for it. I thought it was a completely unilateral act, and I said that if we don't do anything about this, within 5 years we shall lose the Suez Canal on the same principle, which in fact proved to be exactly right, almost to the day.
The Labour government dispatched paratroops to the Mediterranean to stand by for an invasion of Abadan. This rang alarm bells in America. President Harry Truman was amazed at what he saw as trigger-happy irresponsibility.
We had perhaps a different concept of the priorities involved. Our main desire was to be sure that Iran was saved for the free world. The illegal Communist Party of some 15,000 members conceivably could have taken over and invited the Soviets in. We thought that this should take precedence, saving Iran, ahead of commercial considerations.
The Americans thought the British attitude to the Mossadegh government was short-sighted. Mossadegh might not be ideal, but he might prove a useful ally against the Russians.
He was expecting the Americans to help Iran by giving Iran necessary, equipment, experts, and allow Iran to export its oil, including to American purchases. And he thought that America would come to Iran's help because, Americans had expressed sympathy on several occasions with nationalist movements in Iran. And also Henry Grady, who was the ambassador, American ambassador in Tehran, had helped Mossadegh personally and officially a great deal.
I think the Americans had been largely responsible for the early incitement almost to the Persians to exchange this 100% British ownership. I have to say that. The American ambassador was very thick with Mossadegh.
The American ambassador in Tehran, Mr. Grady, recently paid a call on the Prime Minister to convey a letter from President Truman. It was a message urging Persia to negotiate with the British. Dr. Mossadegh, whose health is apparently not too good, transacts much of his business from his bed, and so it was on this occasion. A strange scene indeed, yet it would be hard to exaggerate the importance of the message or the problem to be solved. Since then, President Truman has sent Mr. Harriman to Persia to use his good offices in the dispute.
I was afraid the British might bring in violence. They had a very strong feeling that they had a contract there. They were very literal in their consideration of the matter. There were contracts being changed, concessions on oil all over the world, and the British didn't give any consideration to that, which they should have.
It was our asset and not theirs. It's very easy to be generous with somebody else's assets. They felt that popular opinion in Iran needed to be satisfied. They were at some distance from the direct economic and financial consequences of what might be demanded. And so it was easier for them to have bright new ideas. It was for us to think of the consequences of them.
They were very arbitrary with the Iranians. They didn't show them the books. They paid them a very low royalty and didn't give them any idea of what they were entitled to. They also imported Indian labor, and the Iranians were unemployed, and that made them annoyed.
Pressed by Truman's special envoy, the British reluctantly agreed to send a negotiator, Labour Minister Richard Stokes.
Mossadegh used to come occasionally in the evenings and have meals with us. We were out of doors with caviar and servants, and we used to enjoy that. But most days, either Stokes and I would go and call on him. He lived in a very plain little villa, and there he was, always beautifully dressed, standing at the top of his stairs, on his cane, receiving us. He was always very charming to me as a younger man, made a point of that. And we never saw him, you know, this reputation he had of appearing in grey pajamas, bed as the sick man and so on. Never once seen that.
Mossadegh said, well, you know what we want. We want to manage our own industry. But we are perfectly willing to keep your employees. We are perfectly willing to have an arrangement with you by which you will have all the oil that you need. But we cannot have you as a concessionaire.
They could never understand the whole problem of selling oil. We tried for, was it a fortnight? Must have been. To try and teach them, educate them, if you like, to the tanker problem. It's no good expropriating oil if you can't sell it, you can't eat it. And all the tankers were owned by AOC. All the marketing arrangements, highly complex, were in their hands. All part of an international complex of marketing and price adjustments and so on. And they could never understand it. I mean, Mossadegh, it was like, it was literally talking a dialogue of the deaf.
Mossadegh believed that either Iran and the Iranians have to develop their oil, or the oil can wait until there are enough Iranians to develop it. He told me once that under no circumstances I am going to sign a treaty or an agreement with any foreigner which in any way compromises the sovereignty of my country.
$60,000 Persians depend on the company for their living. If Abadan closes, there is no work for them. And Abadan must close if Persia holds up shipment of oil. A great organization will close down, and ruin will come to Persia unless obstinacy gives place to reason.
Newsreels reflected British interests. The loss of Abadan would mean losing not just cheap oil and profits, but putting at risk an international cartel in which the major oil companies controlled the market and fixed the price. With negotiations deadlocked, the company, still in control, shut down the refinery. Britain's tactic was confrontation.
I think it was quite natural that the government should mobilize a force. British subjects many of them were there in Abadan, and it was useful to have a force there in case they had to be evacuated speedily. There was no doubt the hope also, not shared by everybody, but by some, that a show of force of that kind might bring sanity to what we thought was a situation which lacked it.
Well, our view that this would have been a disaster, and we told the British so in the strongest terms. To send a force in to reestablish an oil concession that you haven't been able to negotiate is just not done in the modern era, and we had reached that time. We told the British not to, and of course, we never thought they would. We always thought Morrison was bluffing. And he was. He made the show that he was going to do it if the technicians were removed, but when they were removed, nothing happened. They left quietly.
Right up to the last moment, Mossadegh did not want the British employees to leave. And he did everything in his power to keep them by assuring to them that they would receive the same treatment, if not better, as far as salaries were concerned, accommodation was concerned, all the conditions of employment. He wanted to keep them quite sincerely, and he kept on saying to the British, let us keep your employees as our employees. They said no.
The last 300 British technicians are evacuated a day before the deadline set by the Iranian government. During the early days of the deadlock, British naval and paratroop forces were alerted in Iranian waters, but today the cruiser Mauritius serves as an evacuation vessel for the men who remained until the last minute during the bitter dispute.
Meanwhile, Prime Minister Mossadegh was on his way to the United Nations in New York. The British, unable to use force, had complained that his nationalization endangered world peace. Mossadegh rejected the charge.
C'est en vain que nous avons cherché ailleurs que dans des paroles, des preuves que le royaume.
And his object was to, I think, to cause a split between us and the Americans and play on this Persian patriot, sick man, and so on. And I think he rather made rings round us. I don't think we came out best there. Not true, the Americans weren't taken in. They found him slightly ludicrous, but rather fascinating.
He had a great impact on America, because don't forget that the Americans, most of the Americans are anti-imperialism. And they like to talk to a man who has charisma. And Mossadegh had that charisma. He was an actor in politics. He had his own convictions. Yet in politics, he was an actor.
The Americans still hoped they could bring Mossadegh round to a compromise with their allies, the British. Even the president lent his weight to the cause. There was no deal, but Mossadegh kept smiling.
Je profite de ces dernières heures de mon séjour aux États-Unis pour exprimer mes sincères remerciements envers la nation américaine qui m'a montré ses meilleurs sentiments, ainsi qu'à mes collègues. Il faut changer.
Mossadegh's enthusiastic reception in America only added to British anger. On his way home, he stopped in Egypt. Here he received a hero's welcome from a nation equally determined to be rid of the British. But the British government was by no means reconciled to Mossadegh's triumph. They had a plan for revenge. At the end of 1951, Iran and its rich oil fields had never seemed so inhospitable to the British. The refinery at Abadan was in Iranian hands, and the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company had been banished. But the British had no intention of letting Iran sell what they saw as stolen oil. They imposed a total embargo. Anyone who bought oil from Abadan also bought a lawsuit from Britain.
We were not prepared to see, if we could possibly help it, Iran get away with an arbitrary act of nationalization without compensation and be able to sell oil. We wanted to show the world that they couldn't behave in this way.
The embargo was part of a British plan to unseat Mossadegh and his government. Britain froze Iran's funds and cut off trade links. Mossadegh was dismissed as incompetent.
we didn't think that there was any virtue in rewarding Mossadegh by giving him money. If you had rewarded him in that way, you'd have been perpetuating in power someone who was incapable of bringing any form of stability or prosperity to Persia. For the reasons I've given, he could not govern. And the sooner then that he left power, the better for Persia. Not just for us, for Persia.
Behind the garden parties and the formalities, the British embassy in Tehran became the center of operations. Secret servicemen from MI6 were already installed. They aimed to bolster the opposition to Mossadegh in royalist circles and so strengthen the Shah's hand against his prime minister. Their most important Iranian agents were a family of wealthy merchants, the Rashidians, well known as friends of the British. Communications were maintained through embassy official Sam Fall.
I started seeing the Rashidian brothers in March 1952, and this was a policy of our government and of the embassy in order to have a contingency plan in case the negotiations didn't succeed. We were paying them a small amount of money. I don't know because I wasn't involved myself, but this was for passing a few demands to a likely lad, paying the crowds. You can't do anything in Iran or anywhere else without money.
The Rashidians, I believe, were the British net that was most totally controlled by the MI6. These were true agents in the sense that they worked for the British government and knew they did. What made them very distinctive was that it was important for their type of operation that everyone in Iran would know this. Therefore, when somebody wanted to run for Parliament and wanted British help, either straight help or financial help, everyone knew exactly where to go.
Deputies expected to be bribed, I should think, some of them, but they were certainly helped to come to the right decision.
Pray silence for the Right Honourable Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister.
The new Conservative government endorsed all the policies of their Labour predecessors, and more.
Results cannot be achieved via a wave of the wand. Time is needed for a new administration to grasp and measure the facts which surround us in baffling and menacing array.
They cast around for a candidate prepared to take Mossadegh's place and settle the oil dispute on Britain's terms.
There are a lot more remedies coming. Yeah.
The question was whether we could overturn the Mossadegh government. I'd had a long association with Iran because of my father's connection with the country. And Iranians who were opposed to Mossadegh kept on getting in touch with me. And one of these was their greatest elder statesman, Gavam Sultani.
He was a very wily politician and an operator, and far more likely to manipulate the various parties in the Majlis and get a majority. He was a very, very professional, wily, and I don't say devious, but elastic politician, and he was most likely to get a majority together.
He got in touch with me several times and said he was prepared to do something about it if only the British government would give him their blessing. And he came and talked to me here about it. But the Labour government and even the Churchill government were a bit slow at first.
The opportunity came in July 1952. Mossadegh unexpectedly resigned after crossing swords with the Shah over his powers as Prime Minister. Encouraged by the British, the Shah appointed Kavam. Tehran became paralyzed by mass protests demanding Mossadegh's return. The Shah and Kavam sent in the army.
I was taken out by my brother to the area where the main demonstrations were taking place. And you could see the running battle that was going on between the people and the police and the soldiers and even tanks which I myself saw from a third distance, and saw in fact one of them shooting, one of the machine guns of the tanks shooting. And the people were extremely determined and extremely angry. And each time they were being driven back into the little alleys, they would surge back and try to fight against soldiers and the policemen with the stones and cobbles that they were picking from the street. Some soldiers and officers went over to the crowd and decided not to shoot, and were carried on the shoulders of the demonstrators. And this was widely publicized and celebrated.
The shooting had left 45 dead and hundreds injured. But with the army's loyalty in doubt, the Shah and Qavam had to accept defeat. Mossadegh returned to office, promising a shake-up in Iran's corrupt and pro-British establishment.
The popular reaction to the resignation of Mossadegh in Tehran was such that Qavam couldn't continue. This was a real setback. I think at the same time the military takeover in Egypt was taking place, was it not? It was a bad week.
The Qavam setback drove Britain to yet more devious means. Meanwhile, they continued talks on the oil dispute, knowing their demands were unacceptable to Mossadegh.
We'd been sitting together at his bedside, iron bedside, for hours and getting very heated about it all. And suddenly he rings a little bell, and in comes a servant with a great plate of sweetmeats. And he said, "Now to send the cameramen in." And I said, "Look, we're in the middle of a discussion, Prime Minister. Is this the moment, really, for sweetmeats and photographers?" He said, "Yes, because sweetmeats will do you good. Sugar's very good for you. But the cameras, you know, it's an instinctive reaction of all human beings. When the camera comes in, they smile." And he said, "We've got 50 cameramen. You'll have to do 50 smiles. Then I'll kick him out, and we can resume. You'll be in a much better frame of mind." Of course, he's got something there. He really wasn't... He was a highly civilized person.
The smiles were mere diplomacy. Back at the embassy, George Middleton wrote a cable to the Foreign Office. It was circulated in the cabinet. Mossadegh's megalomania is now verging on mental instability. It now looks as though the only thing to stop Persia falling into communist hands is a coup d'etat. The British looked for allies in the Iranian army, until now controlled by the Shah. Mossadegh was determined to reduce the monarch's power. He took over from the Shah as Minister of Defense and retired leading royalist officers. From amongst this disaffected group, Middleton suggested one General Zahedi be recruited to lead a coup d'etat against Mossadegh. Ironically, Zahedi had been imprisoned by the British for pro-German sympathies during the war, and a British ambassador had once condemned him as vain, plausible, and thoroughly untrustworthy.
Well, I went out to see him when he was living in his country estate, and I used to go out partridge shooting, so if I had a gun with me, it looked all right. It didn't look like a terrorist act, it looked like a sporting occasion. And changed cars 3 times at his request, and finally drove up to his country estate.
He seemed tough. He wanted to be quite sure that the Shah was with him and the Americans. But he was very ill-disposed towards Mossadegh. He could see Mossadegh was leading the country to hell on a wheelbarrow, and he obviously liked the idea of power and all the perks that went with power.
He wanted an assurance that money would start flowing, really without money to the Treasury. And we had talked quite openly at that time of a line of credit or of 10 or 20 million pounds. It sounds like nothing in today's terms, but in those days it would have helped them quite a bit.
With rumors circulating in Tehran, Mossadegh denounced the embassy as a nest of spies. In October 1952, he broke off relations with Britain and expelled all its diplomats. They could no longer mount their coup. In America, a new president had just been elected, Dwight D. Eisenhower. Could his Republican administration be persuaded to help? British Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden went to meet him, taking men from MI6 and the Foreign Office to consult the CIA.
We went there really, I would have said, to persuade the Americans at that stage that we weren't going to get anywhere with Mossadegh, and that his remaining in power was very dangerous to both our interests, and also to tell them a little bit about the means we had at our disposal for changing the government. And we felt, after we'd been talking for some time, that they accepted that Mossadegh remaining in power would eventually lead to a communist takeover.
It was my feeling then, it remains my feeling, that the British understood the extent of paranoia in this country concerning communism. This was the day of Joe McCarthy, and that the British consciously played on that fear in order to help persuade us to involve ourselves in the coup.
Eisenhower appointed John Foster Dulles to take charge of foreign policy. To him, anti-communism and American big business were two sides of the same coin.
One night at the Iranian embassy, the then Ambassador Saleh and myself talked to John Foster Dulles. And John Foster Dulles made it very clear that Iran will not be allowed to get away with the nationalization. And his argument was that if we let you get away, then what's going to happen to Kuwait, to Saudi Arabia, to Iraq, and all our American holdings all over the world?
Encouraged by the response of the Americans, MI6 set up a team in Cyprus to keep in radio contact with the Rashidian brothers in Tehran.
They had a very wide range of contacts, particularly in the bazaar, and the moneyed or hopefully moneyed classes were getting worried. They saw that their prosperity was being threatened, and opinion was building up among those classes against Mossadegh, and they also had contacts with the Ayatollahs and a sort of merchant religious movement going through to the people, and a little bit of rent-a-crowd sure to have provided a strong popular demonstration against Mossadegh and in favor of the Shah.
Central to the Rashidians' network were the mob leaders based in the traditional athletic clubs, where physical prowess and protection rackets went hand in hand. Here could be found men in the pay of Iran's ruling class, who could provide the rent-a-crowd the British needed. The British pinned their hopes above all on the Shah. To their dismay and that of Iran's elite, Mossadegh's reforms were reducing his powers to those of a ceremonial monarch rather than a ruler.
The Shah was exceedingly weak. He was vacillating, and he was afraid, and he just didn't know what to do. He didn't like Mossadegh. He realized that Mossadegh was threatening his position, but he was unable to screw up the courage needed to dispose of Mossadegh.
Although the Shah failed to act, the British kept trying. In March 1953, with Britain's agents fanning the flames, a hired mob called for Mossadegh's blood. Intrigues grew as the politics of the street took over and Mossadegh's supporters rallied to his defense. His moderate allies in Parliament were now deserting him, but he was supported for the first time by the communist-backed Tudeh Party, a development the CIA played on in their propaganda.
What we did from Washington was to write some of the articles that would appear in the Persian press. And these articles would appear, thanks again to the Rashidians, who had contacts, I believe, with probably 4/5 of the Iranian press. And any article that I would write, it gave you something of a sense of power, would appear almost instantly the next day in the Iranian press. And they were designed to show Mossadegh as a communist collaborator and as a fanatic, as a person who didn't understand that you could be both nationalistic and positive.
When weeping, fainting, bedridden old Mossadegh has trouble with the Majlis or Parliament, he goes to the people for a referendum to have it dissolved. But more than 100,000 citizens of Tehran, including every available member of the Communist Tudeh Party, turn out to vote yes and be marked with indelible ink so they won't vote again. Understandably, few oppose the skinny old man who controls the army and the police, and the supervisors at the opposition voting place have nothing to supervise. Mossadegh, who is not a communist, has won with communist support. Can he now get rid of his dangerous new friends?
Meistens diese Menschen, die waren Demokraten, Antifaschisten, sagen wir Intellektuellen, auch die Offizielle von Partei, das heißt die Militärelemente, die in Organisationen waren, die waren nicht davor, gegen Mossadegh zu putzen, weil sie im Endeffekt selbst Patrioten waren, Nationalisten waren.
A certain number of people thought that he was leading Iran towards communism. That was, you know, the communist bogey which was represented to the United States and was the cause of the United States action in removing Mossadegh. I think that also was totally wrong. Mossadegh was not going towards communism.
Mossadegh had two complexes. One was that he had a martyr complex, that if I die for my country, or if I am jailed, I jailed for my country, that's an honor. The second was that he depended so much on the people. He was a kind of the populist person that he said, people always will protect me. And as long as I have the people, nobody can have a coup d'etat against me. And I guess that was the reason that he neglected everything. And even when the coup d'etat came, he didn't do anything about it.
In August 1953, Britain and America were ready to act. The American ambassador was recalled to avoid implication. An American agent persuaded the Shah to sign this decree and arranged an army unit to deliver it to Mossadegh.
The original coup plan was based on the fact that the Shah had the ability to dismiss a government. And therefore, what was going to take place was that an officer in the army would take a firman, a notice, to Mossadegh and inform him that he had been replaced and that General Zahedi would become prime minister.
Le 25, à minuit, on a envoyé des chars et des mitrailleuses avec un officier, lequel était Nassiri, un colonel de la garde royale, signifiant à M. Mossadegh qu'il était démis. Alors Mossadegh a écrit sur l'enveloppe « Reçu, je déciderai ». Et il a donné ça. Alors quand on a vu des tanks, on ne vient pas tout de même à 1h du matin avec des tanks pour demander la démission d'un Premier ministre. Et encore, on n'a pas le droit de le demander. Mossadegh aurait dû agir immédiatement et faire fusiller le lendemain, par la loi martiale, tous ceux qui ont été inclus dans cette histoire.
When news of the attempted coup was heard, Mossadegh's supporters took to the streets, venting their anger on symbols of royalty. The Shah himself fled the country. But the CIA did not give up. They looked for a way to turn the protests to their advantage.
Dann gab es spontane Demonstrationen. An dem Nachmittag, dem 25. Morat, gab es natürlich eine große Demonstration im zentralen Platz Teheran-Tuprane. Eine große Demonstration, eine breiteste Demonstration der Tudeh-Partei. Natürlich die den Versuch des Amerika verurteilt haben, die die Bevölkerung aufgerufen haben, den Mossadegh zu verteidigen und diese nationale Regierung auf der Macht zu behalten. Und die haben für eine Republik sogar sich ausgesprochen. Die haben die Parole des Volksrepublik ausgebrochen.
Well, as soon as this occurred, these two agents that I mentioned saw the opportunity and sent the people we had under our control into the streets and acted as if they were Tudeh. They were provocateurs, but we had more than just provocateurs. We had a lot of shock troops who actually acted as if they were Tudeh people throwing rocks at mosques, at priests.
With Tehran now in chaos, the CIA persuaded the royalist army officers to try again. Brandishing copies of the Shah's decree, they advanced towards Mossadegh's house. Meanwhile, the Rashidians and their friends mobilized their mobs to do battle with Mossadegh's supporters.
That mob that came into North Tehran and was decisive in the overthrow was a mercenary mob, had no ideology. And that mob was paid for by American dollars. And the amount of money that was used it has to have been very large.
There were lots of people in the streets, standing on the pavements and wondering what was happening. There was a lot of, in fact, talk and conversation and debate, etc., as well, speculation. And I saw a few lorry loads of people standing in these lorries, looking like ruffians and thugs, carrying clubs and sticks, and shouting slogans against Mossadegh, and occasionally in favor of the Shah. That was what was happening in the morning. We didn't take it very seriously. We knew that there was something wrong, but we thought perhaps that things would turn the other way. But in the afternoon, it became clear that things were much more serious, and the news came that Mossadegh's home had been surrounded.
Gradually, the shooting started, and I told him, "Sir, I think it's better you leave the house." He said, "No, if it's going to happen, if it is going to be coup d'etat, I think it's better I stay in this room and I die in this room, and I will never live here."
The battle at the house raged for several hours. Over 100 lives were lost. The Tehran mob took their revenge by sacking and looting the Prime Minister's residence. Mossadegh surrendered. The coup had succeeded. Britain had got its revenge, and the newsreels gloated.
General Zahedi, the new premier, emerges as the hero of the hour, for he it was who took charge of events and organized the movement that threw Mossadegh from power. The people showed their preference in no uncertain manner, and after 9 hours of bloodshed, the forces of the Shah were in command, and Mossadegh's reign as virtual dictator of Iran had ended.
The Shah had fled Iran in fear. Now he returned in triumph. While in public, the Shah held parades. Behind the scenes, he settled old scores, imprisoning and executing his opponents. Soon, he signed a deal with Western oil companies. But it was America, not Britain, that now called the tune in Iran. And the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, renamed BP, had to share its former monopoly with American oil companies.
Certainly BP didn't come out on top, but they came back with a major share in the international consortium, which was subsequently set up. And I suppose from my own point of view, I'd have probably sat there for another 10 years in that appalling heat instead of doing some much more interesting jobs, which I was allotted to later.
In the military court at Tehran, where he's been on trial for treason, the Persian ex-premier, Dr. Mossadegh, demonstrates that he knows how to make an entrance. Clad in his accustomed dressing gown and pajamas, he even makes a dramatic scene out of taking his place in the dock. What a performance!
Britain and America had orchestrated the downfall of Iran's only democratic leader, a man of principle whom in other places Britain might well have welcomed as the successor to empire.
The West wanted to misunderstand him. None of them is interested in Mossadegh as a person. They're all interested in him as the person who canceled the oil concession. If they had wanted to understand him, I think a great deal could have been made for the future. As I said, the present situation in the Middle East might not have happened.
Next week in End of Empire, Egypt. The book of the series is available from the ABC shop in your capital city.
I've been a man of peace, working for peace, striving for peace, negotiating for peace. I've been a League of Nations man and a United Nations man. And I'm still the same man, with the same convictions, the same devotion to peace. I couldn't be other, even if I wished. But I'm utterly convinced that the action we have taken is right.
Napoleon once said Egypt is the most important country in the world. And I think he was right. It is the crossroads of Asia, Africa, and the Mediterranean. It's the bridge. And it became, of course, more important with the building of the Suez Canal.
So the Suez Canal is the cause, you might say, it's the cause of the humiliation we had by British occupation of Egypt for more than 70 years.
For the British Empire, Egypt was more than pyramids and sphinxes. It was the Suez Canal, the lifeline of the empire. In the Canal Zone, Britain maintained the world's largest overseas military base to deal with any threat to the empire's trade and stability. The vast bulk of Britain's possessions lay beyond Suez. Although Egypt was nominally independent, British control was overwhelming and in 1936 was legalized by a treaty. The Egyptians could do nothing but smile.
Mr. Anthony Eden presided when the Anglo-Egyptian Pact was signed.
Of their common interests and the symbol of a freely agreed and enduring partnership between the British and Egyptian people.
For Egypt, the treaty was signed by the Premier, Nahas Pasha. For Britain, by Mr. Eden, the Foreign Secretary. Outside the Foreign Office, Nahas Pasha made a short speech for the GB camera.
I'm very happy to sign the treaty. Treaty of friendship and alliance between the two people. Friends, England and Egypt.
The friendship was unequal. The British ambassador continued to lord it over Cairo, driving home to the Egyptians their servile position. He habitually referred to Farouk, the king of Egypt, as the boy, and even imposed on him Britain's choice of prime minister. During the Second World War, Cairo became the military nerve center of the British Empire. Prime Minister Winston Churchill and his number two, Anthony Eden, came here repeatedly to oversee campaigns in Africa, the Middle East, and Southern Europe. In the 1936 treaty, Britain had undertaken to reduce the number of its troops in Egypt. After the war, it failed to carry out that promise, provoking Egyptian nationalists to guerrilla warfare. By 1950, the 80,000 troops, as they tried to suppress the challenge, found themselves facing grenades, kidnapping, and sabotage. British families had to be evacuated.
Well, we were supposed to be guarding the most strategic part of the world. This is what we were always told, that we were on active service. But the sporadic activities of the Egyptian guerrillas effectively tied us up in our own camp. And they were effective insofar as that they almost made us prisoners within our own camp.
كل واحد بيقدر يعمل أي حاجة بيعملها. ممكن يعني حتى الأطفال يعني اللي ما يعرفش يعمل حاجة هو بيضرب بالطوب. فكان لما تمر أي عربية من الجيش البريطاني بتبقى في خطر من كل ناحية. ويعني كان العربية اللي تنزل كانت مضطرة اضطرار شديد جدا. فكانوا بيلاقوا مضايقات كتير لأن كان يهمنا إن الناس دول يمشوا بأي طريقة.
Britain kept up its troop numbers, if only to guard its military airfields, railways and supply depots. The Egyptian government accused the British of breaking the treaty, and in October 1951 tore it up. The man responsible had himself signed the treaty 15 years before, Nahas Pasha.
The parliament was so 3 minutes at least standing applauding Nahas Pasha. All over Egypt, from Aswan to Alexandria, demonstrations, and from all people, Fellahin, laborers, everybody in Egypt was so happy.
Anti-British posters are swept along on a rising tide of nationalism as Egyptians of all classes heap abuse upon the country that defended their frontiers in World War II.
The Egyptian government secretly backed the guerrillas on the Canal Zone. 2 of King Farouk's senior ministers explain why.
In order to prove to the United Kingdoms, to the leaders of Great Britain, that the base is useless, as we explained to them in the negotiations. The base is useless, and we denied to them all privileges delivered to them by the treaty, and we made a law that prevents any Egyptian to deal with the British. And the punishment. It reaches to capital punishment. To give them any ammunition, any stocks, any dealing with the British. It was prohibited.
حتى كان عندي 130 عجل موجودين في كارانتين البورسعيد. سبتهم عشان امون الاهالي. اديهم للناس. مش قد الجيش البريطاني، يعني كنا عاوزين يعني نعمل لهم مضايقات بكل الاسباب، كل السبل.
So I was decided with some of my friends who was been treating me that we must fight all the British troops which at Egypt for these troops whom were help the Europeans to treat us as animals and insects and something that.
With the winter of 1951 came escalating violence throughout the Canal Zone. The Egyptian police recruited and armed part-time guerrillas who attacked British troops. The British responded with increasingly severe search and destroy tactics. By January 1952, the British had had enough. Troops cordoned off the town of Ismailia and surrounded the police headquarters.
This was the scene in Ismailia after British troops had waited while orders were broadcast to Egyptian police to leave their headquarters and surrender.
After 1 hour, or more or less, I had some casualties in the area. And the switchboard man asked me that the Minister of Interior on the telephone, he wants to speak to the officer in charge, who was me. And I spoke with him. He said, what's going on? So I hold the telephone, and he heard the shooting of the British troops.
Interior Minister Seragadin took his opportunity. If British Commanding Officer Brigadier Exham wanted a showdown, so did he.
He said, well, what are you going to do? I said, we already have our own decision. And he asked me what it is. I said, we are going not to surrender to the terms of Brigadier Exham. And we are not going to leave this place, even if we all die. And I told Brigadier Exham that I know he will enter this place, but only he will receive dead bodies. So the minister said, all right, God will be with you. and the line was cut after that. Every minute we got casualties. I mean, lost his arm, lost his leg, severe wounds.
To save heavy British losses, which would result in storming this armed fortress, Centurion tanks blast their way into the target. After the softening up process came a determined charge as the Fusiliers burst into the now ruined building.
I was surprised at the carnage. It was quite awful, really. I think there was about 50 Egyptians killed. There was quite a few wounded, and quite seriously wounded, some of them.
By early evening, the British had a change of heart. To continue would do more harm than good. The Egyptian police chief had the same idea.
I decided to put an end for that, believe me. So I decided to go out. Either I kill Exham or he killed me. Because it was, if you, Hitchcock himself can do this terrifying atmosphere. So when I went out, I was shocked by seeing a general, a full general, General Matthews. It was about 6 o'clock in the afternoon. And before I went to Exham, because he was my aim, he saluted me. And I was astonished. A general, a full general saluted a captain. So I stopped and I saluted him. And he spoke with me very nicely and very encouraging. And he said, anything you want, all your terms, I am ready to accept it.
By the time of the surrender, at least 50 policemen had been killed at the Ismailia police barracks, also known as the Governorate.
When Colonel Malik entered the Governorate, after this event was finished, about 7 o'clock in the afternoon, he put his hands on his eyes and he said, what a rotten job we have done.
The next day, crowds in Cairo took their revenge on foreigners. Many were killed as the Turf Club, Shepherd's Hotel, and some 400 other buildings were burned in what became known as Black Saturday. But Anthony Eden kept a cool head.
He decided that the troops should not be moved from Ismailia, which we were quite capable of doing, and that Farouk must be left to deal with the situation which he had largely created by arousing the fury of the Cairo mob against Britain.
King Farouk and his government were failing to drive out the British. Others thought they could do better.
From Cairo come these first authentic pictures of the bloodless coup by which the army took over control of Egypt. It was the end of the king's attempt to maintain power. To the ordinary Egyptian, the change is welcome, and it seems that Mohammed Naguib is assured of support at home. What the change will mean to the rest of the world, we have yet to see.
General Naguib was a figurehead. Soon, a younger and more forceful officer was calling the tune, Colonel Gamal Abdul Nasser. He and his colleagues took up the task of expelling the British with renewed vigor. They sought an ally in the traditionally anti-imperialist Americans, who were taking a growing interest in the Middle East.
The Americans in that period were very active, and they were also interested because they were also interested in the pacts, in the mutual security pacts. So they were coming out with formulas. I remember that practically all the formulas which were given to us by the British later on were previously given to us by the Americans, and the Americans played the role of, they were the sounding power, if you want to say so. They modified some things with us. They appeared to us as if they are playing the role of an honest broker.
In the Cold War, American Secretary of State John Foster Dulles was looking for allies to join Western pacts against the Russians. When he visited Cairo in May 1953, the Egyptians asked for arms for their own use. Dulles refused, but for one small exception.
We just opened our first meeting, and the press was all there, of course, taking pictures of the gathering, and then that phase was finished, and they all went out, and the door was closed. And Dulles reached behind his back and pulled out a box and handed Naguib a pistol. And all hell broke loose, really. You see, it was an insignificant thing, but it looked like a symbol. It looked like we were offering to back Naguib against his adversaries, which included, of course, the British. It didn't make us very popular in London.
During the course of their talks, Secretary Dulles, while seeking the safeguarding of the Suez Canal, agrees that a withdrawal of foreign troops should be effected as soon as Suez guarantees can be made.
The U.S. both sort of urged or pressed the British to try to be forthcoming to make a deal, and also offered, as I recall it, the Egyptians various, I think some economic and military aid if a settlement could be reached.
It was only natural that using one side against the other, we could get better out of it. And that is why we had very close contacts with the Americans to influence the going on of the negotiations that were going on at that time between us and Great Britain to evacuate the British forces.
كان الغزاة الأجانب يحتلون أرض مصر، يحتلون القواعد المدججة بالسلاح، ترهب الوطن المصري وتحطم مقاومته.
By 1954, Britain's Foreign Secretary, Anthony Eden, had concluded that the Suez base was more trouble than it was worth. But his view was rejected by a noisy backbench movement within his own party, the Suez Group, and by his Prime Minister.
Churchill was the man who said that he had not become the Queen's First Minister, or the King's First Minister in those days, to preside over the dissolution of the British Empire. And he realized the crucial importance of the Suez zone, the Canal Zone. This was the strong point for the Navy, the Air Force, the Army, linking the Commonwealth as a defense unit. And he was therefore very much against the proposed withdrawal. On the other hand, he was 80. Eden, who was his crown prince, was for it. The Americans were for it. Of course, the Russians were for it. So he was in a difficult position.
In fact, he was eventually reasoned out of this attitude, largely by the chiefs of staff and also by Anthony Eden himself, who felt that we had to redeploy our forces, that to keep troops in the Canal Zone was a nonsense in modern terms, because instead of defending the Canal Zone against some potential aggressor, Russia or whoever might invade the Middle East and try and take the canal, the British garrison there, which was some 80,000 strong, was in fact defending itself against a hostile population, and therefore was really performing no useful military role whatsoever.
In September 1954, Anthony Nutting and President Nasser signed the agreement under which Britain at last consented to withdraw its troops, a task that would take 20 months.
After I'd signed the agreement, Anthony Eden sent me a telegram saying, "Don't come home immediately. You've had your head in details of negotiations, both you and Nasser, for the last 2 months. Go off and find out what makes the man tick. Talk to him and find out how he sees the future." And I came back with this report saying I thought that he was a man of considerable charisma. He was a great patriot, determined to remain neutral as between the power blocks in the world, but equally prepared and anxious to have good relations with Britain and to open this new chapter on a friendly note. And Anthony Eden seemed to share this hope at that time. But then, of course, the situation changed.
Egypt celebrated the beginning of the British troop withdrawal, seen by Nasser as the removal of imperialism from the Middle East. At the same time, the British put forward a new scheme to maintain their whip hand in the area, the Baghdad Pact. Britain's friends and allies, Turkey and Iraq, welcomed the security of British backing and joined the pact in February 1955. In the same month, Britain tried to persuade Egypt to join. The British embassy in Cairo had often been the place where Egypt's future was decided. Now Anthony Eden came here with an entourage of Britain's top diplomats and soldiers and invited President Nasser to dinner. It was to be their only meeting, a meeting between two worlds.
At the beginning, you know, there was some social talk when Mr. Eden, before dinner, when Mr. Eden was talking, as a matter of fact, about him being an expert on Egyptian affairs. When President Nasser, as a matter of fact, did not utter a word at that part. It was Eden, the star of Western diplomacy, talking about the role he played in the signing of the treaty of 1936. And he even greeted President Nasser when he entered in Arabic, and Nasser was astonished.
For some reason or other, Anthony Eden tried to upstage him, and Nasser resented this and clearly showed his resentment. And from then on, the two men really, I think, rather disliked one another. And this, of course, did not help to produce this friendly relationship that I thought I'd laid the foundations of only a few weeks before.
It was in their interest, just as much as in ours, we thought that they should join the Baghdad Pact. And after I'd finished describing this sort of general strategic concept, Anthony asked Nasser if he'd like to comment on what I'd had to say, and Nasser said, well, I agree completely. Well, that rather flummoxed me, because we then went on, and Anthony Eden tried for the best part of an hour to convince Nasser what I would have thought was the logical conclusion of that they should join the Baghdad Pact. But no, for a solid hour.
It was not only a Nasser idea, but it was a national question. I mean, that we are refusing to join any pact because we believe that if you want the colonial power to leave the door, they shouldn't come from the window. So that's why we are refusing the idea, and we were reluctant to accept the idea that the Russians are the main threat to us. We in all our history, we never felt that the Russians are really a threat to Egypt or to the Middle East. They never attacked us, never in all our history. But we were repeating that the main danger was the existing of the policy of Israel.
Within days of Eden's meeting with Nasser, Israel countered Egyptian-backed border raids with a full-scale attack on Egyptian troops at Gaza. Nasser decided he must at once buy new armaments. Britain and America turned him down. So Nasser was driven to a rival source, the Soviet Union.
Nasser was living at that time in the Revolutionary Council building. So was many of the Revolutionary Council members, and we were spending days and nights discussing the political, aspect of the question, whether if we take such a step. We knew how antagonized the Western countries and America would be. But at the end of the discussions, we found out that we had no other alternative except to go for the Soviet Union.
I would say that when we started having some feelers about the possibility of having arms from the Soviet Union, there was this idea vague in the air that maybe if the Americans got wind of what was happening, they will come with the arms. This did not happen. And I remember that even after the Russians gave their first okay, that Nasser said to Byron, the American ambassador, I have a Russian offer here in my desk. And it is for the first time that I am asking for American arms. And there was no answer. And they thought he was bluffing.
On the question of arms, I never got an answer from Washington that I could pass on to Nasser. I was never told why, but it was perfectly obvious to me that the supporters of Israel is a very strong political force in American domestic politics. And I think there was a reluctance in Washington to take on that criticism in arms to Egypt.
Encouraged by the leaders of the non-aligned nations, Nasser concluded his deal to buy Russian arms in September 1955. To Dulles, this was an act of aggression. More offensive to Eden was Nasser's propaganda radio station, the Voice of the Arabs, beamed all over the Middle East. Its appeals to Britain's Arab allies to throw off their shackles disrupted Eden's carefully laid plans.
The Voice of the Arabs and Nasser's positions at that time created a tidal wave of Arab nationalism in the area. And the British were unable to understand that this was the normal reaction of a suppressed revolution, evolution in the making. And they considered it all plotting by Nasser and, a grand design.
The Voice of the Arabs first hit home against the British here in Amman, the capital of nearby Jordan, provoking a crisis that would lead Anthony Eden into a whirlpool of misjudgments over Egypt. Britain was still the dominant power in Jordan, and the young king, Hussein, had been ready to join the Baghdad Pact. But so strong was the opposition of Jordanian nationalists, encouraged by Nasser's propaganda, that the king backed down. Some Jordanians thought that the British, furious at the king's retreat, might go so far as to remove him.
Well, you see, the British thought this Baghdad Pact was so vital for Western interests, for British interests, especially in this area, which is very important, as we know all. And they thought that by mobilizing all the states in this area to join the Baghdad Pact, Turkey, Iran, and Iraq, they will form a formidable strength in the face of any Russian advance. For that purpose, the monarch of Jordan was really not somebody whom they would weigh against such an important goal they were looking at, aiming at. They were going to sacrifice the king so that Jordan will join the Baghdad Pact under the name of unity with Iraq.
Jordan's army, the crack troops of the Arab world, were maintained by Britain. Now, some young officers aimed to be rid of the British, and particularly of their British commander-in-chief, Sir John Glubb, known as Glubb Pasha. For Eden, Glubb was a trusted man in a key position. King Hussein, whose grandfather had been given his throne by the British, was caught between Britain and his own nationalists. At this difficult moment, Glubb proposed to dismiss certain young officers. The king was told that the British were also planning to get rid of him.
The situation was not a very, very pleasant one here at all, in point of fact. I think that it was very close to the boil. And people still looked at me as a person they cared for. I was my grandfather's grandson, and his choice to take over his position. The Baghdad crisis, as far as Jordan was concerned, was just over. The area was in turmoil. The country was under many pressures, and it was a state of agitation. But more than that, just probably a couple of days before, we had received a list of dismissals of some Jordanian officers, and I really felt that that was the end of it. I couldn't sign it and destroy the chances of some officers who might have been able to serve their country.
The king called me from his cousin's house, and he said, "Can you do it tomorrow?" He meant, "Can you effect your operation tomorrow?" I said to him, "Even now, I'm ready." So he said, "All right, I'm coming to see you." He came to the palace, and we met in my office. And we decided at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, everything will be done to take control of the army, to put in custody all the British officers in all the units, fighting units. And only one man not to be touched, to give him as far liberty as possible, not more. That was Glubb, because he was the head.
Well, I was in my office one morning and I got a telephone message asking me to come down to the Prime Minister's office. I walked into his office and sat down. There was nobody there. He came in a minute or two later. Of course, I'd known him for 25 years or so.
Yeah.
And he said, really, it's very painful for me, but I've got to tell you that the King says that he thinks it's time you had a rest. And he said, well, we'd like you to leave in 2 hours.
2 hours after 26 years. Why should they give you such a fantastically short time limit as that?
Well, I think some of the advisors had told the King that I should probably refuse to go and call out the army and try to make a revolution or something like this.
Could you, in fact, if you wanted to, have called the Arab Legion out against the King and deposed him and taken over and everything else?
Well, I wouldn't go as far as that, but one could have made a lot of trouble, of course, but it's just the kind of thing you don't do. I spent all my life serving them.
Whatever plans Glubb may have had been preempted. Many in the Conservative Party demanded a Churchillian smack of firm government. But Eden, not Churchill, was now Prime Minister and had to deal with Glubb's dismissal.
This came, of course, as a body blow to Eden's pride and vanity, and his reaction was violent, and he looked around for a scapegoat, and the scapegoat was Nasser, because Nasser was obviously delighted that General Glubb should have been removed. But Nasser had not been behind it. Nasser had not ordered the dismissal of Glubb, but and Eden was convinced that he had.
No truth whatsoever. Nasser had no idea what was happening here, or certainly didn't know of our decision. And I think it was as much a surprise to Nasser as it was to the world as a whole.
Misunderstandings increased. On the day of Glubb's dismissal, the new Foreign Secretary, Selwyn Lloyd, happened to be in Cairo visiting Nasser.
Nasser was really surprised that it happened, but he, at the beginning, he thought that the British did it and timed it with Selwyn Lloyd's visit to Cairo as a sign of goodwill towards the Arabs. So it was a misunderstanding, obviously, which led to, after that, to so many complications.
I was horrified to get a telephone call over an open line to the Savoy Hotel in which Anne Eden said, "What's all this poppycock you've sent me about isolating and quarantining Nasser? Can't you understand, and if you can't understand it, will you come to the cabinet and explain why, that I want Nasser," and he actually used the word murdered.
Eden was by now convinced Nasser was out to destroy any remaining influence Britain had in the Middle East. He declared a personal war on the Egyptian leader. Eden knew what the Nile meant to Egypt. He had been the driving force behind an Anglo-American offer to build a dam across the Nile at Aswan. It was to be the biggest dam in the world, and for Nasser, symbolized his promise to regenerate Egypt. Eden now determined to stop the project. Dulles had his own reasons for agreeing and cancelled the dam loan. Nasser's survival in power was at stake. He had to produce a stunning response.
On July 26th, Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal Company. At Alexandria, an inflamed and engulfing crowd heard President Nasser say, "At this moment, some of your brothers are now taking over the Suez Canal. The canal," he said, "is the property of Egypt. 120,000 Egyptian workers died digging the canal. We will build the high dam."
The nationalization surprised the British and French, who for 70 years had run the canal despite growing Egyptian resentment. Nasser knew, though, he had not only the Egyptians, but the law on his side.
Well, we were studying that for more than 2 years, but not nationalization. We tried to study the history, our rights, and the rights of the Suez Canal Company, the rights of the users. But after the withdrawal of the high dam loans and aids, we thought that we must nationalize the Suez Canal Company. They used to take 16 million pounds to be distributed every year, and we thought that the Egyptian people can use these 16 million pounds for the development of their projects.
I told him I thought he had missed, his staff had missed the point completely. They had judged the French and British reaction mostly because of financial loss in shares of the Suez Canal Company. And I said I didn't think that was the answer at all. It was bound to be a very emotional issue.
Plainly, a great issue had arisen. I thought, and my friends thought, that the withdrawal from the canal zone had been potentially fatal to the unity of the Commonwealth. Was there now an opportunity to retrieve it? I was convinced there was, and that if we pressed an attack against Egypt, political if possible, but military if necessary, we could recover the ground that had been lost.
Our quarrel is not with Egypt, still less with the Arab world. It is with Colonel Nasser. We all know this is how fascist governments behave. And we all remember, only too well, what the cost can be in giving in to fascism. We cannot agree that an act of plunder, which threatens the livelihood of many nations, should be allowed to succeed.
I think he was secretly rather delighted, because this gave him the pretext to marshal his forces, literally military forces, to destroy this man on whom he had declared his personal war at the time of the dismissal of Glubb. Which pretext up till then he had lacked, because Nasser had done nothing to offend, done nothing to give Eden any possibility or excuse for taking direct action of any kind against Nasser.
Has there ever been a time during this crisis when you thought the British and French might actually use force?
Well, of course, because of these threats of use of force, concentrations, and movement of troops, I thought that any time I'll be facing an act of aggression. Until now, I'm still thinking. No, I think it is a matter of prestige. I think they are sure that we will not close the canal or raise the tolls. Because if we close the canal, we'll be in trouble. Suppose we close the canal against Britain, what will be the result? Britain will have the cause to defend her interests, to defend her economy, and then they will be able to have an aggressive action against Egypt. I don't think at all that we will be in a position to be in war with Britain. I think British are sure that we will not have any discrimination against them, against their lifeline, as they said, against their economy. But really it is a matter of prestige.
His estimation was that if the British did not interfere directly in the first 2 weeks, then every week after that the possibility of military intervention will diminish. So the most important thing was A, to know what is the state of preparedness now, B, to know what are the possibilities of political maneuver so that we can gain time. And his estimate was, if they don't have enough power to interfere now, then all our policy should be directed to gaining time as much as we can.
Meanwhile, the Egyptians kept the canal working efficiently and piloted through more ships than ever. Nasser was careful not to give Eden the pretext for the military action he wanted. Equally determined to avoid war were the American President, Eisenhower, and his Secretary of State, Dulles.
During the summer, Dulles essentially invented a series of actions or steps like the London meeting, like the Users Association, like the meeting at the UN, all of which were designed to try to keep the negotiating process going and to keep things from coming to a head, which would give the British a pretext for using force. And I think that Eden became aware of what was happening, and he became resentful because he felt that In a sense, Dulles was outsmarting him, that he thought he would get Dulles into a corner in which he would be able to say to Dulles and to Eisenhower, you see, we've exhausted all the other possibilities. There's nothing to do but to resort to force. And every time he tried to do that, he'd think he was having him in a corner, and Dulles would come out through a new trap door and avoid getting trapped.
The world was indeed happy to share the gratification of President Eisenhower yesterday when he opened his televised conference by saying, I have an announcement. I have got the best announcement that I could possibly make to America tonight.
After 3 months of negotiations, a formula for agreement was worked out, the 6 principles. At last, a solution to the satisfaction of all looked likely.
Most gratifying. Egypt, Britain, and France have met through their foreign ministers and agreed on a set of principles on which to negotiate, and it looks like here is a very great crisis that is behind us.
And we thought that we were gaining time and that we were diffusing the crisis. The 6 points in the Security Council, I remember that when we returned back, the message from Hammarskjöld, the message from the Indians, when I returned back from the meetings of the Security Council around the 15th of October, President Nasser was completely under the impression that the crisis is over.
So far as Eden was concerned, he didn't want a negotiated settlement. He wanted to topple Nasser. And I think almost Eden's worst moment in the whole of the Suez crisis was when Selwyn Lloyd, Christian Pinault, the French foreign minister, and Mahmoud Fawzi, the Egyptian foreign minister, reached an agreement of the Suez Canal question in New York, behind the scenes at the United Nations, towards the end of October of 1956.
Eden seemed to have lost his chance for revenge. But while the Foreign Secretary was at the United Nations, Anthony Nutting, the Minister of State, was with the Prime Minister at his country residence, Chequers. Here, a French mission arrived with an audacious plan. Israel should attack Egypt across the canal. France back them up, repossess the canal, and topple Nasser. But they needed one more essential ingredient.
The only snag, of course, was that the French did not have bomber bases anywhere near enough to take care of Nasser's air force. Only the British did. So the British had to be brought into the conspiracy with France and Israel. And at that moment you could see the whole cloud had disappeared for Anthony Eden. This was the opportunity to put into effect his declaration of war on Nasser, because Nasser had refused to give him any pretext, even after the nationalization of the company. But with the Israelis marching on the canal, he could say the canal is going to be irreparably damaged by warfare. We must intervene and put out the fire. We must intervene and stop the war.
The plan was put into operation. Israel invaded on the 29th of October. On the 30th, Britain and France issued an ultimatum, demanding both Egypt and Israel withdraw 10 miles from the canal, or they would invade. On the 31st, when the ultimatum expired, seaborne troops set out for the invasion, and, as arranged, Britain bombed Egyptian air bases.
Flown from aircraft carriers were hundreds of sorties attacking military targets near Port Said. This followed up heavy bombing raids which had already put Egyptian airfields out of service and all but destroyed Nasser's air force.
I've never known anything like it in my whole diplomatic career, and I've been to several hot spots. It was quite extraordinary. We had virtually all the United Nations against us, and it wasn't only in their resolutions. There was a sort of almost a personal atmosphere about it.
My government and the French government are accused of committing an act of aggression. This, Mr. President, is a very serious charge to make in the Security Council, bearing in mind the provisions of Chapter 7 of the Charter. We strongly deny such charges and do not think it will be profitable for the Council to discuss them.
We used to always have our drinks with the American delegation. We were close friends. At the time of Suez, about 2/3 of them wouldn't talk to us. And the one or two who did were rather brave. We felt like pariahs, sort of, underdogs and outcasts.
I doubt that any delegate ever spoke from this forum with as heavy a heart as I have brought here tonight. We speak on a matter of vital importance, where the United States finds itself unable to agree with three nations with whom it has ties of deep friendship, of admiration and respect, and two of whom constitute our oldest, most trusted and reliable allies.
And of course we were meanwhile lying through our teeth to the American ambassador in London and saying that we had no knowledge of any Israeli intention to attack Egypt. And when the Israelis did attack and we drew up the famous ultimatum telling everybody to clear out of the canal zone, Egyptians and Israelis, we again lied to the American ambassador and said that this was the first intimation we'd ever had of any Israeli intention to march into Egypt, onto Egyptian soil.
Anthony Nutting and two other ministers resigned, but gave no reasons. So the demonstrators protesting throughout Britain did not know the full facts. Eden's conspiracy with France and Israel, his deception of Parliament, country, and allies. In his television broadcast to the nation, Eden relied on this ignorance. He tried to stop the leader of the opposition from making a televised reply, but the BBC judged the nation so divided that it had to overrule the Prime Minister.
What should we do? We put the matter to the Security Council. Should we have left it at that? Should we have been content to wait to see whether they would act? How long would this have taken?
The Council had met, reached a clear decision, and been blocked by the Prime Minister's own veto. There was no lack of speed here. The trouble was obstruction by Great Britain.
What we did do was to take police action at once. Action to end the fighting and to separate the armies. We acted swiftly and reported to the Security Council, and I believe that before long it will become apparent to everybody that we acted rightly and wisely.
It is not a police action. There is no law behind it. We have taken the law into our own hands. The Prime Minister has said we were going in to separate the two sides. But you don't separate two armies by bombing airfields and landing troops 100 miles behind one side only. No, this is a second onslaught on a country which was already the victim of an attack.
At Port Said Harbor and nearby, British troops came ashore. They were consolidating the work already done by paratroops and marine commandos in occupying this famous town at the north end of the Suez Canal. The capture of Port Said was more difficult than was expected. Fires were still burning, result of house-to-house fighting, which General Keighley has described as very tough. But as the reinforcements came in, the battle was over. Happily, at surprisingly little cost, just over 100 killed and wounded.
It was not the condemnation of the world, but lack of money that pulled Eden up short. The day British troops had landed at Port Said, the pound sterling collapsed.
Eisenhower was very serious about this issue, and he was determined that he was going to bring it to a stop. So when the run on sterling began and the British turned to him to try to bail him out, his answer was, quit and I will. And I think he simply didn't have any intention of temporizing with it. He wanted it stopped, and that being the case, he was prepared to take whatever steps he could to bring it to an end.
The British Empire had discovered the limits of its power. Eden had no choice but to withdraw.
Before leaving, the troops leave a reminder of their 7-week occupation, a huge Union Jack nailed to a 180-foot flagstaff. This was made into a greasy pole to delay would-be climbers following the departure.
2 months after the invasion, Anthony Eden resigned as Prime Minister. He He had been a sick man for many months.
Now, can I just say, thank you very much for all your kindness to me, all of you, during my period of office. I wish my successor all good fortune and Godspeed to you all. Goodbye.
Thank you very much.
We'd been architects of the UN. We were founders of an organization to keep the peace, not through force, but through negotiations and peaceful methods. And here we were, having to take an entirely different road. I thought we'd never hold our heads up again. Point of fact, within 6 months we did. But at that time, this was the end of empire for us. It was like Götterdämmerung, if you like, in a Wagnerian sense. And I don't want to go through that again.
You know, after Suez, Nasser became a hero. It changed him completely from being a ruler or a potential leader or a leader, and it made him a hero. And the effects, as a matter of fact, in Africa, the winds of change in Africa started after Suez.
On the one occasion they met, Eden had talked down to Nasser. Eden, then, was confident of his position. After Suez, it was Nasser who had the confidence. Britain's imperial standing had taken a knock from which it would never recover.
When the British Empire had agreed to give independence to all its principal colonies in Asia and Africa, Aden had other ideas, as you'll see when End of Empire continues next Sunday at 8:20. Stay with us now for a benefit gala to honour the celebrated bass baritone George London, recorded in Vienna and simulcast with ABC FM.
For 128 years, Britain ruled this obscure corner of the Arabian Peninsula. Now, one of the few signs left of the British presence is this bizarre scrapyard of weapons, a reminder of the most chaotic closing chapter in the entire history of the end of the empire. Near the wrecks stands a military cemetery. The men buried here died in the withdrawal from a colony Britain wanted to leave at any price. In the 60s, these narrow streets were the scene of a bloody civil war. 20 years after India gained her independence, Britain was trapped in a war over a colony she had already promised to leave. Soldiers were fighting and getting killed for no reason anyone in Britain could understand.
I don't believe that we need necessarily have left Aden in the way we did. In almost every other case, every other colony we left, the bands played Will You Know Come Back Again, and there was a great deal of tear-jerking, and in some instances, a lot of people regretted the fact that we'd gone. But we left Aden rather like thieves in the night.
Queen Victoria was left behind. Today she rests at the back of a museum. In 1839, this colony became the first imperial acquisition of her reign. Aden was a fishing village when Captain Haines of the Indian Navy landed here and defeated the local sultan. This superb natural harbour was at first thought vital to safeguard the route to India. After the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869, Aden started to prosper. Aden was at the centre of the British colonial trading system. Ships stopped here for fuel en route between Europe and India, the Far East and Australia. It was still a loyal imperial outpost in 1953, when the newly crowned Queen Elizabeth paid a visit on her world tour.
Soon after coming ashore, the Queen took the salute and marched past. The bearing and discipline of every unit parading on this proud occasion was most impressive. The Arab people, many children among them, were obviously eager to catch a glimpse of the Queen as she presently drove off towards the RAF hospital.
The Queen's visit really was quite astonishing. I'd never expected to see such popular jubilation and all the rest of it. There was some dancing in the streets and singing, and there was not a voice raised in opposition at all.
In the 50s, Aden became the busiest harbour in the world after New York. And in 1954, BP opened a huge new refinery to process oil from the Gulf. The British enjoyed the good life in the little Raj. Pampered by Arab servants and catered for by Indian traders, they felt safe in this imperial backwater. Throughout the 1950s, as the empire was being dismantled, Aden's economy boomed. It was a duty-free mecca for the thousands of tourists off the ocean liners.
Movie camera, projection, watch it. Hello? Hologram, please. No, come inside. Come inside.
Lost in time, British rule went on in the old colonial style, as if nothing had happened. Around the colony of Aden itself was a wilderness, the British protectorates, an area as large as England and Wales, occupied by feuding tribes. When Britain grabbed Aden, she had no interest in these lawless territories other than as a defensive zone. Tribal rulers, like the Emir of Baihan, were persuaded to sign treaties of protection and to accept political advisors. The few Britons who entered this medieval world could do little to change it.
I was coming down from up country and I stopped in a village. I heard a clanking noise at my feet. And I looked around and I saw a kind of grill in the ground below. And I could hear somebody moving about and clanking. And I asked who it was, and they were all very evasive, the sheikh in particular. So I said, get this chap out. And they brought him out, and he had a beard down to his waist, and he's dressed in rags and emaciated to a degree. And I asked how long he'd been there, and nobody could remember. And apparently he'd been locked away years before, and there he'd been left. So I told, and he was shackled, hands and foot, and I told them to knock the shackles off and let the fellow go free. I thought he'd thank me for the good deed, but far from it. He complained that from now on nobody would give him any food.
In the protectorates, around 500,000 people scratched a living from the barren soil. Unlike their neighbors in Saudi Arabia, the tribal rulers had no oil and practically no other source of income. Britain bought them as allies with a few rifles and a little money.
This then is the Aden Protectorate. And one of the main reasons for the cessation of barbarism here is the Aden Protectorate levies, a small but compact force formed in 1928. Few recruits can write, so an inky thumb signs them in for an initial 4 years.
This army of Arab soldiers under British officers brought the British and the Sultans into close alliance. The colonial power also employed a more modern system.
What happened was that if you had a tribe that was causing trouble, you got hold of its sheikhs and you said, well, you either do as you're told and hand in hostages to answer for your good behavior, or we're going to come and bomb you. And you gave them time to clear out of their villages or houses and get their flocks and herds out of the way. And then you went off and dropped bombs, small bombs on the whole. And it was a remarkably efficacious and cheap way of maintaining law and order in otherwise unget-at-able areas.
Until the 1950s, air policing subdued the warring tribesmen. But even this remote corner was about to be transformed by the nationalist revolution sweeping through the Arab world. The tribesmen were radicalized by a new voice from Cairo. Gamal Abdel Nasser became the champion of the Arab world after his triumph over Britain and France in 1956. He transmitted the anti-colonial message even to the South Arabian protectorates.
Nasser turned to be a hero, a legend, to hold all the Arab people. For the first time they hear an Arab leader who is challenging a big power, insisting on the freedom of all the Arab world and on the Arab nationalism.
Wherever you went in the protectorate, you could hear the Cairo radio coming out of these transistor radios. You'd find some old gentleman dyed in blue woad plying his field with Nasser's propaganda coming out. And it was almost impossible to counter. It was, after all, calling for freedom from foreigners. I didn't believe that our propaganda, such as it was the slightest bit of use.
Cairo radio denounced the sultans with their British arms as enemies of the Arab Revolution. The sultans were so worried by this propaganda that they took up a British plan to form a federation for their defense. In 1959, the Federation of South Arabia was established. Eventually, most of the rulers were to sign up. Britain built a Whitehall in the sand and palaces for the sultans. In the new federal capital, the rulers performed a charade of parliamentary government. One of the few sultans with a formal education was their principal spokesman.
We had a system which worked, and we saw no reason to experiment modern or Western democracy in a country where it failed. It failed everywhere in the Middle East, and there was no point in trying to experiment it in our country. But we had a system which worked, and the rulers were elected by their tribal leaders. And whether now by Western concept this may not sound democratic, but according to our customs, it was democratic.
The absence of elections and the autocratic ways of the sultans ensured that the British and the sultans themselves did not know the extent of nationalist feeling among the people in the protectorates.
كنا نعارض الاتحاد الفيدرالي لأنه صنيعة من صنايع الاستعمار. وكنا نعارض حكومة الاتحاد لأنها مكونة من الأمراء ومن السلاطين. ذلك الاتحاد الذي أقامه المستعمرين. وكنا نشعر أن أجداد أولئك السلاطين وآبائهم هم الذين وقعوا مع المستعمرين الحماية معاهدة الحماية.
In Aden, prosperity had attracted a huge influx of immigrant workers from all over South Arabia. They joined trade unions that took up the Nasserite anti-imperialist cause and opposed the federation with strikes and demonstrations. The British colonial authorities ignored the nationalists and gave full backing to the sultans and their federation.
I think there are two things one was trying to do. First of all, one was trying to prepare the ground for eventual independence, because after all it was a very, very backward state of affairs. You had a colony and a whole lot of little protected states. And at that time, obviously, we should have begun to think about eventual independence. And then later on, it seemed to me that we should be able to get what we wanted, let's say what the British government at that time wanted, which was a friendly government with which we could negotiate a treaty and make whatever arrangements we wanted for use of the facilities in Aden.
The main facility was a huge military base designed to restore the tottering British presence in the Middle East. Britain had been kicked out of Egypt, Iraq and Jordan. So Aden now became the headquarters of Middle East Command. In the early 1960s, thousands of British servicemen and their families settled in Aden. The British government made it clear repeatedly that the base was permanent. The nationalists in the Aden trade unions, inspired by Nasser, campaigned against this old-fashioned imperialism. But the vast majority of Adeni workers had no vote. The only way they could express their opposition to the federation was on the streets. Their leader was Abdullah Al-Aznag, a trade unionist and nationalist who had close ties with the British Labour Party. He saw himself as a future Prime Minister. The British, indifferent to the nationalist opposition, forced Aden into the Federation, uniting the prosperous port with the backward inland protectorates. But the enlarged federation came under immediate threat. In its nearest neighbor, Yemen, army officers supported by Egypt seized power. The royalists resisted the coup. It was the start of a 5-year civil war. The Egyptians eventually had 70,000 soldiers fighting on the Republican side. Nasser, once a noisy but distant threat, was now at the Federation's doorstep. For the nationalists of Aden and South Arabia, relief seemed close at hand. In 1963, with Egyptian help, the first of them began to operate as guerrillas here, in the mountainous wilderness of the Radfan. They called themselves the NLF, the National Liberation Front. The NLF believed that armed revolution was the only way to independence. Their leader was Qatan Ashabi, a British-trained agricultural officer. He had been in exile in Cairo, and with Egyptian money, set up headquarters in Yemen to direct the guerrilla campaign. The British, to deal with what seemed no more than a severe tribal outbreak, built an airstrip. They flew in troops and supplies. To the British Army's amazement, 2 battalions found themselves tied down by skilled marksmen, no longer obligingly shooting each other, but now aiming at the British.
Our worst casualties happened within a few minutes from a couple of snipers on the hillside behind the village. Most unfortunate. We got over the battle with 4 casualties, 4 wounded, and then we lost 2 men to this wretched sniper and another half dozen wounded.
وفي هذه المعركة اعترف الجنود البريطاني بأنهم يواجهوا ثورة منظمة ورجال مقاتلين يحكموا ضرب رصاصات بنادقهم إلى أجسام الجنود البريطانيين وجعلهم بهذه المعركة ومعارك أخرى يعترفون بأن ثوار ردفان هم الذئاب الحمر من خلال العمليات العسكرية ومن خلال دقة الإصابات الموجهة للجنود الإنجليز.
It was 6 months before the British Army were able to conquer the key positions in the Radfan Mountains. They claimed a great success.
لكن في الحقيقة أننا تمكنا من هزيمة هذه القوة البريطانية رغم إمكانياتها الهائلة. تمكنا من هزيمتها وفي الأخير نحن كسبنا الحرب وكسبنا المعركة وانتصر لنا أصحاب قضية.
Radfan was the starting point for the NLF revolution, which gradually began to spread through the protectorates. Despite the growing nationalist pressure, the High Commissioner, Sir Kennedy Travaskis, and the Colonial Secretary, Duncan Sands, pressed ahead with their plan to give the federal government of the Sultans formal independence. Sands visited the Radfan to congratulate the troops. The British colonial authorities dismissed the NLF as a small band of pro-Egyptian extremists, incapable of effecting their plans for the area. In October 1964, a general election brought the Labour Party under Harold Wilson to power. The Labour Party had attacked the Federation as unrepresentative and reactionary. In opposition, it had supported Al-Aznag and his claim that the Aden workers had a right to vote for their own government. But in office, the Labour ministers succumbed to American pressure not to relinquish Britain's global strategic role. So the government decided that its first priority in Aden was to keep the base. It reassured the sultans that it would stand by the Federation. In 1965, the Labour government called the sultans and the moderate nationalists to a conference in London to try to persuade them to share power. But Al-Aznag, with his large trade unionist and political following in Aden, was not prepared to do a deal with the sultans. He demanded general elections. They rejected his proposals out of hand. Al-Aznag left London empty-handed. The NLF had not been asked to London. They threatened to kill anyone who negotiated with the British. They were still not regarded as a power to be reckoned with.
كان الإنجليز وحكومة الاتحاد يرددوا في أجهزة إعلامهم إن هذه العمليات التي تقام في الأرياف ولا يعلنوا عن كل العمليات ولكنهم كانوا يعلنوا عن بعضها من أنها تمردات قبلية وإنها امتداد لتلك التمردات السابقة التي خضعت في الأخير نتيجة لضربات الاستعمار. ولهذا السبب أسرعنا في أن نبدأ بالعمل المسلح في عدن المدينة على اعتبار أنها ستكون تلك الضربات الموجهة في العاصمة تكذيب بالدرجة الأساسية لأجهزة إعلام الاستعمار.
In the midst of an extinct volcano, Crater, the Arab heart of Aden, became the main battlefield between the NLF and the British authorities. The NLF guerrillas' first targets were the officers in the Arab Special Branch who had successfully infiltrated their organization. The campaign of killing culminated in the murder of the Speaker of the Aden Legislative Council.
واتخذت إجراءات واسعة النطاق من قبل الإدارة البريطانية إثر هذه العملية الناجحة. تمثلت في حظر التجول، تمثلت في مطاردة الناس، تمثلت في الاعتقالات الواسعة، تمثلت في إقامة معسكرات متحركة ومعسكرات ثابتة وحديثة داخل المنطقة كلها.
In September 1965, a wave of riots and strikes protesting at the British plans for independence under the Federation of Sultans forced the colonial authorities to declare a state of emergency. Direct rule was imposed. The Aden Legislative Council was suspended. The nationalists had achieved their objective of creating a confrontation.
Law and order had practically broken down in Aden, and we felt unless we controlled the thing directly, we'd have anarchies, rather like the situation when we imposed direct rule in Northern Ireland.
But wasn't it an admission of defeat?
Well, it was an admission that the policy which we'd inherited wasn't working, and that was certainly the case.
The Labour government hoped that a dash of direct rule would force the nationalists and the sultans to come to terms. Dennis Healy toured Britain's overseas bases as economic pressure forced a change of policy. His first target for cuts was Aden.
We decided to get out in '66, and we decided to get out because there was no case for staying in Aden unless we needed it as a base for action in the Gulf. Once we decided that we were not going to intervene militarily in the Gulf, there was no case for staying there.
Lord Beswick, a junior minister, was sent to Aden to tell the federal rulers that the base was to be closed and they would lose its protection after independence.
Well, Lord Beswick came out in 1966 and told us that the British government has decided unilaterally and without any consultation with us, which went against all the understanding and the treaties we had, to pull out of Aden, to pull out of Saudi Arabia and liquidate the base. And we sensed from that they were no longer interested in a proper handover of responsibility to the Federation. I felt completely betrayed by them. Because what they did was contrary to everything we were led to believe. I think they behaved in a most dishonorable way.
I don't think we'd betrayed them because we never made them any promises. I think that Duncan Sands, as Defence Secretary and Commonwealth Secretary, gave them a totally false impression of what Britain might do.
The breach of faith is clear. And I suppose I ought to know better than anybody because I gave the pledge. In 1964, we had a conference in London at which we had representatives from the whole of the Federation of South Arabia, including Aden, and they said to us that they wanted independence. They'd like it before the end of 1968, but it was no good to them to have independence unless they could have the means of preserving it, and that meant that they must have a defense agreement with Britain under which we would continue to give them protection at any rate for a period after until they were able to look after themselves.
With Egyptian forces across the border and growing violence from the nationalists, the British government's decision had opened the door to chaos. In Aden, Arabs saw little point in helping a colonial power on its way out. The battle for succession began. Adeni nationalists like Abdullah al-Aznag, who had hoped with the Labour government's help to reach power through the ballot box, went to Cairo seeking Nasser's protection. Al-Aznag was now driven to set up a guerrilla movement of his own. It was called Flossie, the Front for the Liberation of Occupied South Yemen. The Egyptian government was keen to help and to have an influence over Aden's future. It tried to form a coalition of the two main nationalist groups, getting the NLF to join Flossie.
We were supporting only the independence of the country, so that's why we are putting a lot of pressure on all of them to come together and have a kind of coalition government. And it's not only that, because we were worried about a civil war in the future. And Nasser was really thinking that in order to establish peace in the area, there must be some kind of coalition government. And not only that, he thought that we must look to the future.
My point of view about a solution in Aden before the British leave is to talk with the nationalists and try to have a stable nationalist government, not a puppet government.
But the NLF, radicalized by 3 years of guerrilla fighting, soon fell out with what they called the bourgeois Adeni politicians. The NLF was stronger in the protectorates, and in Aden they undermined Aznag's power with their increasingly effective guerrilla tactics. They could see no reason to share the spoils and rejected Egyptian schemes. Nasser, angered by the Marxist influence in an increasingly independent NLF, gave Flossie his full support. Each guerrilla movement tried to prove to the people that it was the army that was driving out the British.
Are we running?
So get out of it.
This could be one of the biggest battles yet. The British troops are now going in to try and knock out the Flossie regular machine gun posts. That's fire from both sides. This is probably the biggest single battle that British troops have been involved in with terrorists so far in Aden. We don't know what's going on. British troops are over in that direction, and the Russian... The Flossie commandos are down in that direction, and we're right in the middle.
Such battles forced the British government to seek talks with those it considered terrorists. It sent a minister, Lord Shackleton, to try. The colonial authorities in Aden strongly opposed the initiative.
Naturally, the Colonial Office
didn't like us coming because we were turning everything on its head. And one remembers the remark, classical, I think, of many ex-colonial situations, I will not negotiate with these murderers. But the history of the end of empire is negotiating with whatever you like to call them.
Lord Shackleton's was the first British attempt to contact the NLF after 3 years of fighting. Sir Sam Fall was taken by a go-between to meet NLF representatives in a back street in Crater.
I explained that Lord Shackleton had come to Aden in order to negotiate independence and to involve all parties concerned. The NLF were a very important party to this, and we would be interested in talking with them, and we would, of course, consider releasing their detainees and taking the ban off their party so that we could discuss things in a reasonable and relaxed atmosphere. But there was just one minor condition that we'd like to make. If it were possible, we would be very grateful if they would stop killing us. And the two representatives roared with laughter. And one of them, he did like this, he said, Abu Sami, mush mumkin. Very sorry, Abu Sami, this is quite impossible. But being young, naive and foolish, I said, but why? We come with peace and we want to talk to you. It would be rational if you'd stop killing us. He said, no, you must understand that Flossie constantly accuse us of being the running dogs of the imperialists. And if we, at this moment, were seen to be talking to you, this would simply give credence to their story, that they are the sole representatives of the people of South Arabia and we are imperialist lackeys. And so, Abu Sami, we're very sorry, but we have got to drive you out of Aden. And we have to be seen to drive you out of Aden. When we have reached that stage, then we can negotiate.
إذ أنها تشكل القلب وتشكل منطقة الاتصال بالعالم بأجمعه. وبدون ذلك ما كان للجبهة القومية أن تحقق نهوضا حقيقيا للعمل العسكري أو السياسي أو الإعلامي، ولا أن تحقق انتصارا بهذا المستوى الذي تحقق.
By mid-1967, British soldiers were risking their lives in a colony they would leave in a matter of months.
We were sort of the rat in the trap, waiting for them to come out. You couldn't go around and just look for them. They weren't in uniform. The only way to catch them is to patrol the streets and hope for them to come to you. Every day you'd have a ground patrol going, you'd have maybe a platoon of, say, 9 or 10 men going in. You'd patrol the streets. You might get a small crowd demonstrating, you might go after them, chase them. The crowd would try and draw you into a certain area or run down a certain street where there'd be somebody waiting to ambush, you know.
حيث كان هناك يخرج عدد من الأشخاص قد يصلون إلى 3 وقد يصلون إلى 5، وهناك يجري تدريب كل منهم على حدة أو بشكل ثنائي، يعني على شكل 2-2. يجري تدريبهم على المسدس، ويجري تدريبهم على استخدام القنبلة اليدوية، ويجري تدريبهم على استخدام المتفجرات.
It was mainly grenades. That was the favorite thing. Because with a grenade they could throw it maybe from behind a wall, from a building, or bushes, or from a crowd even.
Is this the one that threw the grenade at Mr. Gilbert?
Yes, the Land Rover.
Well,
yes.
Tell me exactly what happened now.
Well, we're just driving up behind the Land Rover, and this chap drove in front of us. Drove past Mr. Gilbert on the left-hand side and chucked a grenade. Tried to get away, so we got in front of him.
Get back, Chico.
The NLF became stronger, and the British security forces were blighted in their efforts to catch guerrillas by poor intelligence. Few Arabs would help them. Soon, British frustration gave way to desperate measures.
Shut up, right? Get that fucking face. Shut up. What shooting me? Huh? Come on, man. Come on. Come on. I'll fucking shoot you. Come on, man. I wasn't there. Wasn't there. Oh, no, I wasn't there. I want to go. You go to my side. You so man, eh? Say I'm like you, I'm man. Hey. Man. Hey. I'm man. Hey. I'm man.
They're trying to kill us, we are just trying to protect ourselves. People that say we're brutal just don't know what's going on, that's the trouble.
This side, sir. From this side. Yeah, this side, go.
Suspects were rounded up on the streets. They were taken to a barbed wire compound. Hooded informers picked out suspected guerrillas among the detainees. And as official inquiries subsequently confirmed, torture was used.
وكنت واحدا من أولئك الذين قد تعرضوا للاعتقال لمدة 8 أشهر. خلال هذا المعتقل وخلال الفترة التي قضيتها في السجن تعرضت إلى التعذيب النفساني والجسدي الذي تمثل بالضرب والتعذيب بالكهرباء والتعذيب بوسائل عديدة كانت قد تركت آثارا وعاهات لمن دخلوا هذا المعتقل وكنت واحدا من هؤلاء الذين تعرضوا لهذا التعذيب.
The allegations of widespread torture caused an international scandal. This was yet another embarrassment for the British Labour government.
By 1967, the decision had been taken by the British government to leave. There was no intention on their part to reverse or change that decision. There might be limited possibilities in timing, but the decision was to go. So the policy was how to get out the armed forces and the civilian community without a bloodbath and, if possible, handing over to some practicable successor government. By the end, of course, any practicable successor government.
As Britain prepared to pull out, the battle for succession between Flossie and the NLF intensified. With Egyptian help, the Flossie leadership under the Labour Party's former friend Abdullah al-Aznag now set out to destroy the NLF.
Is Flossie the only organisation responsible for the present wave of terrorism in Aden?
Flossie is the only leading organisation that's responsible for the armed resistance of our people.
I see. There has been a lot of talk about a rival organisation called the NLF, which is also claiming attacks. Is there any truth in this?
NLF is a mere label used by the federal and the British administration in Aden to suggest confusion about the fight and struggle of our people for independence. That is to say that they would like to suggest the existence of more than one front. But the truth is that there is only Flossie and nothing but Flossie.
Despite Aznag's protestations, the Sultans were more worried about the NLF. They pinned all their hopes for the future on the federal armed forces. They were much encouraged when the Labour government gave military aid in the summer of 1967 to modernise them. Both the NLF and Flossie were secretly recruiting members in the forces. To ensure their loyalty, the Sultans promoted pro-Federation officers. The move backfired. The event that finally destroyed what remained of the Sultan's power came on June the 20th, 1967. A mutiny broke out in the Federal Army ranks, spreading to this barracks in Crater, where the NLF agent Abdul Razak Shaif, now released from prison, was instigating an uprising.
ولذلك اتجه رجال الجبهة القومية في السيطرة على الموقف وتوجيه هذا التمرد وتحويله إلى انتفاضة من داخل معسكر 20 يونيو، حيث تم توزيع الأسلحة وأخذ المواقع والتمركز في داخل المعسكر وخارجه.
A British Army patrol of 2 Land Rovers carrying 9 soldiers approached the barracks along this road. Fusilier John Story was in the second vehicle. The NLF-led police began shooting from the windows of this barracks.
It happened so fast. It was so devastating. The Land Rover in front stopped. I got shot across the side, I got winged across the side. All I wanted to do was get out. I felt caged in. Our Land Rover slowed down. I jumped out. Our Land Rover continued on for another 50, 60 feet and crashed into the wall of the police barracks. I ran past the corporal in our Land Rover, and he was just lying there still, covered. His chest was just a mass of blood with holes in. And the 2 officers had been shot on fire. I couldn't see the other men. Maybe they were scattered around the ground. I got shot through the arm. There was no cover whatsoever, getting shot from both sides, maybe by 100 or so police and terrorists. They had machine guns, rifles, pistols. I look round. I see in one of the blocks of flats had a doorway open. I ran, zigzagged across the road. The pavement, the road, everything was all jumping and zigzagging. It was like all exploding, all the concrete was exploding around me. But I managed to make it into the blocks of flats.
John Story hid in this block of flats and held an Arab family hostage at gunpoint for 3 hours. He escaped by jumping out of a window. This painting in an Aden museum records the events of the 20th of June 1967, now an historic date in the nationalist calendar. John Story was the only survivor of this ambush. On the 20th of June, 22 soldiers were killed. They are buried here at Silent Valley near Aden.
Unfortunately, events overtook us, but it was not late to put things right, had we been wholly supported by the British government. But because our own army believed that the British government were no longer behind the Federation, and so they were divided, they were looking elsewhere for future governments. But they were doing it because they knew that the Labour government no longer, and the High Commissioner, Trevelyan, was no longer behind the federal government.
The June the 20th shootings led the British troops to withdraw from Crater. The NLF took over, a triumph that resounded throughout the Arab world. The British Army surrounded Crater, cutting off the supplies of electricity and water. Young British officers like Lieutenant Colonel Colin Mitchell of the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders demanded an immediate attack on Crater to avenge their dead comrades. A plan for a limited operation was finally agreed, and 13 days after the June the 20th ambush, the Highlanders retook Crater at dawn without incident. Colonel Mitchell became an overnight folk hero and was thereafter known to the readers of British popular newspapers as Mad Mitch.
What were the reasons for retaking Crater? It has come as a great surprise.
Well, you know, purely as a soldier, the reasons were that the whole prestige of the army depended on going back in, obviously. You know, we were thrown out, truth be known, and we had to go back in. I propose to stay here, if I'm allowed to, with the battalion for as long as, you know, the British are in Crater. And, you know, I've just told them we're a very mean lot. I mean, it's, we'll be very fair, you know. But if anyone starts any trouble, they'll just get their head blown off. They'll get the message in time, you know. This Glengarry helps a bit, you know.
And the bagpipes help.
And the bagpipes, yes. And one or two other things.
The Army High Command overruled Mitchell. They were determined to avoid a bloodbath.
Colonel Mitchell, for reasons of his own, wished to cut a dash with the Argyll Southern Highlanders in Crater. There were 6 other battalions in Aden, all of whom were doing an equally good job and could have sorted the Arabs out too. But they understood that the object was not to sort the Arabs out, but to leave as peacefully as possible when the time came. So I stopped Colonel Mitchell and made him do what everybody else was doing, keep the place as quiet as possible.
For the Federation, the mutiny of its own forces was the beginning of the end. The hour of the Sultans had passed. The NLF stood poised to grab control. The first of the Sultans fell only 24 hours after the June the 20th ambush. On the top of the hill, the Emir of Dala was besieged. Below, his subjects were in arms.
وجيش التحرير قد هو مطوق الفرق المطوقة من المساء حتى وصلنا حوطنا على قصر العميل شعفر. بعد أن وصلت المسيرة الكبرى من جماهير الشعب وجيش التحرير وطوقت على قصر العميل شعفل، أول نقطة ما أطلقنا سراح المساجين من دار الحيط الخلفي هذا، وأخرجنا المساجين، وبعدها كنا نتكلم بالميكروفون ونحن مطوقين على قصر العميل شعفل. قلنا نتكلم عليه معه يعني على أساس يسلم نفسه، وخرج ظهر من الشباك حق الطاقة وتنحى عن الإمارة. الشرط الأول، والشرط الثاني التزم أن يرفع الضابط السياسي فوراً.
One by one, the Sultans fell during the summer of 1967, as British troops pulled back to Aden to prepare for the final withdrawal. In the countryside, there was only one voice. In Aden too, the struggle was to be one-sided. Egypt, defeated by Israel in the Six-Day War, was no longer able to give Flossie the military backing on which it had depended.
I think that Flossie never had a sufficient following in the Federation as a whole. They had a certain trade union-based following in Aden, based largely upon the port, but up country they had very little following, and as it became clear towards the end, they had no strength at all in the armed forces.
British soldiers were under strict orders to take no chances as the battle between Flossie and the NLF raged through the autumn.
Our orders, certainly as we came towards the end, were to play the whole thing as low-key as possible. And the NLF and Flossie were battling it out. And instances we'd see, for example, from our observation positions, would be uniformed men in some instances and non-uniformed in others going to the back doors of houses, be 2 or 3 shots and they'd run out again. And when we'd investigate, of course, we'd find a body there. Now, this is a situation which we've been told we shouldn't interfere in at all. And it was peculiar to the last days of Aden, which our government wanted us to come out as quietly as possible.
One has to remember that this withdrawal from Aden was in no circumstances a war. It was a withdrawal of our presence from a place we've been in for many years. There was therefore, as it was not a war, no conceivable justification for having one young man in the British Armed Forces wounded or killed more than absolutely 100% necessary. How could one, and one was constantly thinking of their families, as one usually is, could one possibly justify to a mother in, say, Yorkshire, that her son, Private Jones, had been killed because of inter-Arab fighting in a place which we were leaving a few weeks later, or even a few days later? And that thought was always in my mind.
In the last 6 months, 30,000 troops pulled out, leaving a rear guard around the British airbase. The High Command was worried that the victorious NLF would carry out its threat to launch a final assault. Off Aden, a task force of 24 ships stood ready to perform a quick rescue. For the NLF, the moment of victory was near. Their colonial enemies were leaving, and their nationalist rivals, Flossie, were defeated in Aden. NLF leader Katan Ashabi summoned journalists to Zinjibar, a small town near Aden, to announce his conditions.
That they will give our people their full independence. That is the first point. Second point, that they realize that the NLF is the true representative of our people. Third point is that Britain is ready to hand over full authority to NLF, and then if I am selected by the NLF command to meet any British authority, or I am ready to do that.
In November, in Geneva, only days before the British withdrawal, the former guerrilla leader, Ashabi, was recognized by Britain as the future head of an independent government. The High Commissioner, Sir Humphrey Trevelyan, took the final salute from the deck of HMS Intrepid. In Aden, there were no fanfares and no formal handover of power. Regimental flags were lowered.
At 1:45, the helicopters lifted the final 330 men from about 10 positions around the perimeter of Aden.
Colonel Di Morgan was the last British soldier out of Aden. He left at 3 o'clock on the afternoon of the 29th of November, 1967.
As I circled the positions which my unit had been occupying for the last day to ensure that everything had been picked up safely and there was nobody left behind, I had a feeling of sadness that I was turning out across the Aden Bay back to Albion, that I was the last man and we were leaving Aden after a British presence had been there for 128 years. It was all very sad.
In the streets of Aden and all over the country there was jubilation. The 128 years of the British Raj, which started with Captain Haines, had ended.
وحينها كان يدور في كنت أتخيل أن الكابتن هينس حينها هزم وأنه بنفس الطريقة التي دخل بها بواسطة العنف والمقاومة أنه خرج بهذا الأسلوب.
Aden was the colony that went over to the other side. The Federation of South Arabia became the People's Republic of Yemen, a Marxist state and an ally of the Soviet Union.
Next week, Archbishop Makarios, the head of the Greek Orthodox Church in Cyprus, is seen also as the founder of Killer Gangs when End of Empire returns at 8:25. And remember, an impressive book of this series is available from bookshops and the ABC shop in your capital city. Stay with us now for the latest news, followed by our Sunday stereo special, Mozart in Delphi.